Springfield, Missouri, 6 p.m., July 21st, 1865. As the sun begins to set in the muggy summer evening, Wild Bill Hickok walks towards the small town square with an unnerving focus and intensity. His red hair, famously worn long in the custom of the Army Scouts and native warriors as a taunt to their enemies looking to scalp them, is wet with sweat and falls out from underneath his wide-brimmed hat in unkempt tangles. He is looking for his longtime acquaintance, and by many accounts good friend, a man by the name of Davis-Tutt. But recent events have turned their once amicable relationship sour. Now, Bill Hickok is intent on settling their feud once and for all. Born James Butler Hickok in Homer, Illinois in the year 1837, he had fled his hometown at the age of 18, after a fight with a local man named Charles Hudson, in which both men had fallen into a canal in the scuffle, and both assumed the other to have been swept away and drowned. Hickok fled to Kansas, where he joined up with the vigilante anti-slavery group known as the Jayhawkers. In 1857, he was elected as one of the first of 4 constables of the Monticello Township in Johnson County, Kansas. In 1859, he had joined with the parent company of the Pony Express, known as the Russell, Majors, and Waddell Freight Company. The following year, Hickok was gravely injured when he was attacked by a grizzly bear, necessitating several months of recovery. In 1861, Hickok was involved in a shooting incident in Rock Creek, Missouri, in which a disagreement over a property payment between local citizen David McCandless and Hickok's friend Horace Wellman ended in a confrontation which resulted when an unknown gunman, by some accounts Hickok himself, shot McCandless while concealed behind a curtain. Hickok, Horace Wellman, and an employee of the Rock Creek station at which the incident took place named J.W. Brink were tried for murder but found not guilty on the grounds of self-defense. While the event is mired in debate and obfuscation, it is known that Hickok was so consumed with guilt over the incident that he visited and personally apologized to McCandless's widow, and offered her all the money he had to his name, a sum total of $35. However, the consuming horror at whatever had taken place that day would have little time to fester in the mind of Bill Hickok. After the outbreak of the Civil War, Hickok would sign on as a teamster for the Union Army in Missouri. In short time, he would become a wagon master. However, in another event in Hickok's past clouded in uncertainty, he was dismissed from the Army in 1862 for reasons unknown. In short order, though, he would find himself riding as a member of James Henry Lane's Kansas Brigade, where he would reportedly meet a preteen Buffalo Bill Cody. In the fall of 1863, Hickok was again serving in law enforcement as the provost marshal of the Springfield Detective Police. This, too, however, would not be a long-lasting endeavor for the 28-year-old. He would go on to work as a scout for General John B. Sanborn before mustering out of that service and, in 1865, making his way to his present location of Springfield, Missouri. Here, he had embarked upon a career as a gambling man, earning his living from his winnings in local saloons. And it would be in the saloons of Springfield that Wild Bill Hickok would meet and befriend fellow recent arrival Davis-Tutt. Tutt, aged 28 or 29, has followed an oddly similar life path to Hickok's. Born in Yellville, Arkansas in 1836, he descended from a politically influential family. At a young age, he had lost several members of his family, including his father, Hansford Tutt, to what became known in Arkansas as the Tutt-Everett War. After the outbreak of the Civil War, Tutt would enlist in the Confederate Army, serving in the 27th Arkansas Infantry Regiment. Though he would serve in the Confederacy throughout the duration of the Civil War, it is proffered by several historians that he actually became a double agent towards the end of the war, working as an informant for the Union. Regardless, after the conclusion of the war, Davis-Tutt had his sights set on settling out west, but on his way, he had stopped in Springfield, Missouri, attracted by the lure of the lively gambling scene. Here, he and Wild Bill Hickok had first met and become relatively fast friends. Though accounts of the depth of their friendship vary, the two were on amicable enough terms to which Hickok had borrowed money from Tutt on occasion. This habit, however, would prove the initial spark in their conflict. As Tutt's own finances have become increasingly strained, he has sought to call in Hickok's present debt to him. The day prior to this, Tutt and Hickok had argued over the exact amount of the loan Tutt had issued. Hickok, who by all accounts had dealt honestly thus far with Tutt, claimed his debt to be $25, while Tutt insisted it was in fact $35. Hickok, already slightly insulted by Tutt's assertion that he was trying to short him by $10, insisted that he would have to check his logbook for the amount that he had recorded when he took out the loan. Tutt, growing equally uneasy under his financial situation, insisted that he be allowed to hold Hickok's gold pocket watch as collateral until the debt had been settled. Much to Hickok's chagrin, Tutt claimed the gilded timepiece and held it overnight. In the interim, though, he had been doing more than simply holding on to his proposed collateral. For much of this day, mutual friends of the two men have attempted to act as mediators, carrying messages to and fro in an effort to assuage any escalation in conflict. But, much to their frustration, Davis-Tutt has continued to not only stagnate negotiations, but to continually antagonize Hickok by wearing his pocket watch out on the local town square, proclaiming to anyone within earshot that Wild Bill Hickok is not a man to be trusted. In the honor culture of the Old West, this was grounds for violent retribution, as a man's reputation, especially a gambler's reputation, as an honest man, was essential to both his safety and financial welfare. Fed up with the attempts at negotiation and incensed at Tutt's public effrontery, Hickok now enters the town square, his eyes scanning the area for Tutt. On his waist, Hickok wears a pair of .36 caliber 1851 Navy Colt revolvers, their handles facing forwards. Every morning, including this day, he begins his day by cleaning his prized firearms, ensuring that they will not misfire in the event that their use is called for. The pistols weigh heavily on his thighs as he walks, a constant, visceral reminder of their presence should they be needed. Though it is a common misconception that gunfights and shootouts were an accepted norm of life on the American frontier in the 19th century, many towns or establishments banned the open carry of firearms, and the notion of a one-on-one pistol duel, carried out in the street in front of the local townspeople, was an altogether foreign concept to the average person in the Old West. However, today, at least for the townspeople of Springfield, Missouri, that is about to change. As Hickok makes his way to the local courthouse, he spies Tutt, still openly wearing the pocket watch he had taken from him. Now, in a veritable fury, still roughly 100 yards away at this point, Hickok begins to close the distance between himself and Tutt. As he walks, he exclaims to Tutt from across the town square, "Don't you come around here with that watch." Tutt, himself having grown increasingly indignant and angered at Hickok's refusal to acquiesce in their dealings, turns so that he is facing sideways towards Hickok, who by this point is roughly 75 yards away. The bustling town square, once full of local citizens out to shop, eat, and socialize, clears of all but the most curious of onlookers, as the certainty of oncoming violence causes most to seek cover. In a scant few seconds' time, Tutt, standing his ground, reaches for the revolver on his own hip. With this minute movement, which takes only milliseconds to make, Davis-Tutt seals his own fate. At the same moment Tutt's hand flashes towards his holstered weapon, Hickok's right hand moves across his own body, drawing the pistol from his left hip. Tutt manages to bring his weapon to bear on Hickok and fires upon his tall, long-haired opponent. But the shot misses. At essentially the same time, Hickok returns fire. By some accounts, he steadies his Navy Colt revolver upon his left forearm, before firing off a shot that strikes Davis-Tutt between the 5th and 6th rib. Tutt grasps his side and cries out to his friends who are watching, "Boys, I'm killed." In a grisly and regrettable scene, the terrified Tutt now scrambles like a wounded game animal in a directionless, instinctual flight. He runs onto the porch of the courthouse, then back into the middle of the street, leaving a streak of gore, before his adrenaline-fueled legs give out and he finally collapses. A sickened collective silence falls over the spectators for a distinctly prolonged instant, before friends and onlookers swarm towards Tutt's body in an effort to assist the dying man in any way that they can offer. Meanwhile, the local sheriff makes his way towards Hickok, who offers up his weapons with no resistance and freely admits to having killed Tutt in the gunfight. He is subsequently arraigned for manslaughter, briefly placed under arrest, and made to stand trial. The trial, which lasts a mere 3 days, sees Hickok acquitted on account of his engagement with Tutt being one of, quote, mutual combat. Conflicting testimonies and eyewitness accounts would state that Hickok was the only man who had fired, or that he had not in fact called out to Tutt from across the town square. And the jury would ultimately conclude that Tutt's flaunting of the watch in public had been adequate grounds to incite Hickok to violence, thereby justifying, even necessitating, the confrontation. It would be mere weeks after the shootout, and Hickok's subsequent not guilty verdict, that a writer for the New York City publication Harper's Magazine named Colonel George Ward Nichols would conduct a series of interviews with the former scout-turned-gambler and gunfighter. The subsequent publication of Hickok's story turned him into a national celebrity virtually overnight. Local sentiment among the citizens of Springfield, though, proved not to be entirely in Hickok's favor, as he would run for the position of town marshal only months later and lose decidedly in what many saw as a collective statement of townspeople believing him to in fact be guilty. Davis Tutt would be laid to rest in the Springfield, Missouri cemetery, though 18 years later his body would be disinterred and reburied in the Maple Park Cemetery by his half-brother, Lewis Tutt, himself a product of Davis Tutt's father's extramarital relationship with a female slave. Hickok would, however, go on to greater fame over the course of the ensuing decade, before himself meeting a violent end at the hands of a disgruntled gunman. In the annals of Old West history, few, if any men, can lay claim to as much influence over the cultural landscape of the time as Wild Bill Hickok. He was the prototype for the late 19th century American frontiersman, equally capable on the trail, at the poker table, or in a gunfight. Hickok was, in fact, a deeply complex and thoughtful man, far from the steely-eyed, swashbuckling image that is often portrayed in modern media. He did, however, live a violent, dangerous life, one in which he would live by, and die by, the gun. But the many tales of the deeds, daring, and ultimate demise of one of the Old West's greatest characters are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Natchez, Mississippi, September 19, 1827. Just as the late summer sun nears its noontime apex over the Mississippi River, two boats paddled their way through the muddy water towards a small island. With the clear blue sky and warming temperature, the seemingly placid scene might be mistaken for a group of picnic or party-goers making their way to their much-awaited destination. But the business at hand this morning is of a far more serious nature. On this morning, a feud between two prominent local citizens, one Dr. Thomas H. Maddox and one Samuel L. Wells, will be settled. Both men have agreed to settle their long-standing enmity in the form of a pistol duel. After what has amounted to months of negotiations as to the time, place, and conditions of the duel, they have agreed to meet at this neutral site of this island ensconced in the middle of the river. Each are accompanied by their seconds and their surgeons. Among those in the boat with the Wells party is a steely-eyed 31-year-old who, though not one of the duelists scheduled to fight that morning, has set his mind on settling a score of his own on this day. The man's name is James Bowie, otherwise known as Jim Bowie. Born in Kentucky in 1796, Bowie's family had moved to Opelousas, Louisiana in 1812. Here, on the ragged edge of the American frontier, he had grown up hard as the ninth of 10 children. He is known as a man not above working outside the confines of the law, having spent considerable time running what amounted to 19th century real estate scams and capturing and returning escaped slaves to bondage with his brother throughout the 1820s. However, on the frontier, where the rule of law is often seen as more of a subjective measure than an absolute dictate, this has not wholly soured his reputation. Bowie is, in fact, known by many as a congenial, thoughtful individual, quite the conversationalist when he has a mind to be. However, he is also known as a man not to be trifled with, and one not known to forgive a slight to his honor lightly. And on this day, Bowie has his sights set on one Major Norris Wright, a member of the opposing party, and a man whom Bowie has a long-standing, bloody feud. The year prior, Bowie had returned from one of his many trips made in efforts to proffer his ongoing real estate scheme, in which he and his brother John Bowie attempted to lay claim to and sell off parcels of land that did not belong to them. Stepping off of the riverboat and onto the shores of Alexandria, Louisiana, Bowie had been informed by his brother that Wright had been demeaning his reputation about town, calling into question his character and castigating Jim Bowie as a thief and a liar. This was an affront that, in the eyes of Jim Bowie, could not be suffered. He had immediately made his way to Bailey's Hotel, armed with only a pocket knife. Here, he found Wright engaged in a card game. Bowie immediately demanded to know whether the rumors about town were true, and whether or not Wright cared to repeat them now in person. For his part, Wright drew his pistol without so much as a single word, centering the sights on Bowie's torso. At the same time, Bowie had reached up for a chair that was close at hand, raising it up to block himself from the brunt of the forthcoming bullet. For a few tense moments, the pair stood frozen in a standoff, until Bowie had raised the chair above his head in order to attack Wright. Wright had fired, striking Bowie on the left side. The shot had ricocheted off of a coin pouch Bowie carried under his vest, causing only a painful flesh wound. Bowie then lunged at Wright, knocking him to the floor and holding him down with one hand as he struggled to pull his folding pocket knife out with his other. With the blood-soaked hand being too slick to pry open on its own, Bowie placed the blade between his teeth in order to pry it open. The knife was then wrenched from his hands by Wright's friends as they desperately tried to separate the two men. With the knife now gone, Bowie sunk his teeth into the hand of Wright. Finally, he was pried from atop Wright, leaving one of his teeth embedded in Wright's fingers. Though the two were separated, their feud was still unsettled. Bowie was taken upstairs to recuperate, and tensions continued to rise for months. In today's duel, Norris Wright is a member of the supporting party for Dr. Thomas Maddox. Many members of both parties are uneasy that the feud between the two duelists will not be the only conflict settled that day. As the boats pull onto the sandbar shore of the small island, Bowie departs the vessel with the rest of the cohort supporting his friend, Samuel Wells. For roughly 20 minutes, the particulars of the precise location to be used on the island, and arguments over who will be allowed to accompany their fighters, ensue. Interspersed with these heated conversations are the repeated protests being offered up by two members of Dr. Maddox's party, James A. Denny and Robert A. Crane. They urged both duelists to settle their differences in a more amicable fashion, and lament the forthcoming bloodshed. But neither participant can be dissuaded from their aims of settling their feud with pistols. For his part, Bowie remains distant from the proceedings, resting under the shade of a small grove of willows. Though he is ostensibly there only to support his friend, he is keenly aware of the presence of his hated rival, Norris Wright, as a member of the supporting party for Dr. Maddox. In fact, other members of each party have long and torrid histories with one another. Richard Cooney, a member of the Wells party, and Robert Crane also have a long-standing, heated feud themselves, in which Crane has recently threatened to shoot Cooney on sight. These underlying tensions swirl beneath the collective apprehension of all the men now on the small island. Finally, though, matters are settled in preparation for the duel at hand. As Bowie and friends remain under the willow trees, Dr. Maddox and Samuel Wells now take up their pistols, march to their determined positions, take aim, and fire. A large cloud of smoke then obscures the beach as the onlookers brace themselves to see the result. However, in an instance not uncommon in frontier duels, both shots have missed. Attempting to seize this brief but seemingly fortuitous moment, Dr. Denny makes another hardened plea for both participants to set aside their arms and settle their differences peaceably. But again, he is rebuked, as neither Maddox nor Wells feel their honor to have been satisfied. The pistols are reloaded, and again, the combatants take their places, aim, and fire. But, in a miraculous stroke of luck, both shots, again, miss their mark. Finally, with both men feeling as though fate has been amply tempted, Maddox and Wells agree to shake hands and lay their dispute to rest once and for all. Maddox makes his way towards Bowie and the rest of his party, heartily proclaiming that amends have been made and that he intends to now share a glass of wine with his former rival. Maddox, Bowie, and company now make their way towards the party of Samuel Wells, with most in the group being overjoyed at the peaceful outcome of what could have been a tragic affair. However, while Maddox, Wells and most of the others are in a jovial mood. The pre-existing tensions between both Richard Cooney and Robert Crane reach a flashpoint. As the two parties reach within earshot of each other, Richard Cooney calls out to Robert Crane, saying that, since Crane had previously threatened to shoot him on sight, now would be an opportune time to settle their differences here on the beach. Again, cooler heads on both sides attempt to argue for a peaceable solution, and beseech both men not to break the newly garnered peace between both groups. However, before the situation can be diffused, weapons are drawn. It is unclear who drew their firearm first, but within seconds, several men on both sides, including Jim Bowie, had their pistols drawn and ready to bear. Again, though, the men are convinced to halt in the interest of mutual peace. The men in each party all holster their weapons. All of the men, that is, except for Robert Crane and Jim Bowie. For a fleeting few moments, the armed men are locked in a standoff, unsure of the other's intentions or next moves. Then, suddenly, believing Bowie to be the leader of an ambush, Crane fires his shot first at Bowie. The bullet misses Bowie, as did Bowie's return shot, which, in the closest shot yet of the day, managed to graze the cravat that Crane wore around his neck. But now, any previous peace deal is presumed moot, and full-on, blood-drenched frontier chaos ensues. Crane immediately draws another pistol from his waistband, firing another shot which misses Bowie but strikes his hated rival Richard Cooney in the thigh, severing an artery. He then turns and sprints towards the grove of willow trees in hopes of escaping the retaliation of Jim Bowie, who is now in hot pursuit of the man who has fatally injured his friend. Bowie draws a second pistol himself and fires upon the retreating Crane, but again misses. Now, out of options by way of gunpowder and lead, Bowie reaches for the large leather scabbard on his belt, which contains a gift from his brother, Resin Bowie, made for just such an occasion as this. Sheathed in the scabbard is a large knife, measuring 9 inches in length and 1.5 inches in width, with a crosspiece set above the handle to stop the user's hand from slipping forward. After Jim Bowie's earlier fight with Major Norris, Resin Bowie had given him the knife as a gift, stating that this weapon would not require loading nor present the danger of misfiring. Now, in a fury, Jim Bowie draws the knife as he pursues Crane, angrily calling out, "Crane, you have shot at me, and I will kill you if I can." Crane, in a panic, and now with no more shots to fire, turns and desperately hurls one of his pistols at Bowie, striking him in the head and nearly buckling the knees of his pursuer. However, Bowie, now in a froth, continues his pursuit, seemingly otherwise unfazed by the vicious blow. Dr. Maddox now rushes to restrain Bowie, but is quickly thrown off. But then, momentarily, Bowie, now feeling the full effects of the vicious blow to his head, staggers to a large driftwood log and leans upon it wearily, in an effort to collect his senses. Meanwhile, at the same time, the rest of Crane's friends, including Bowie's hated rival Norris Wright, rush to assist their comrade. Wright approaches the temporarily disoriented Bowie, pistol drawn. Seeing this, Bowie indignantly rebukes him, "You damned rascal, don't you shoot." Seeing Wright approach, one of Bowie's friends hurriedly hands him a loaded pistol, and within seconds, both Wright and Bowie fire at each other from mere yards away. But, again, both shots miss their mark. Now, Wright draws a second pistol, and Bowie, out of arms and ammunition, calls out to his enemy, "Shoot and be damned." Just before Wright has time to shoot, James Denny, also a member of Bowie's party, grabs Bowie by the shirt collars and demands that the violence be stopped here and now. But again, the cries for peace are drowned out in the storm of unfolding violence. As the melee unfolds, shots ring out once more, with George McWhorter, another one of Bowie's friends, firing a shot that strikes Norris Wright in the left side. Wright then fires at Bowie, whose shirt collars are still firmly in the grips of James Denny. The bullet hits Bowie in the chest, puncturing a lung, and tears off one of Denny's fingers in the process. Wright cries out that he has been mortally wounded, but in reality, he has only sustained a flesh wound. Jim Bowie, though bleeding profusely, struggles free from the grips of Denny, and now, in an animalistic fury, pursues his long-hated rival Norris Wright down the beach, with his long blade still glistening in his hand. Bowie manages to catch up to Wright, but just before he can land a fatal blow, 2 more shots ring out from 2 more of Wright's friends, in Alfred and Carrie Blanchard. One of these bullets strikes Bowie in the thigh, bringing him to his knees on the small strip of sandy beach. Now, both Wright and Alfred Blanchard draw their sword canes, a relatively common weapon in the area at the time, and move towards Bowie in hopes of delivering the coup de grace. But, despite repeatedly striking Bowie, neither are able to inflict a mortal wound, as Bowie defends himself with his own blade and by deflecting blows with his arms and hands, incurring several more injuries in the process. The brutal affair reaches a grisly culmination when one of the men's thin swords becomes embedded in Bowie's sternum, bending the blade and rendering it temporarily inextricable. Then, in what was later characterized by one of the witnesses as a, quote, wonderful exertion, Bowie pulls himself into a seated position, and like a mad tiger swipes at and grasps the collar of Norris Wright, who, in struggling to free himself, inadvertently pulls Bowie to his feet. It is in that instant that Jim Bowie's reputation is solidified forever. According to his own later account, he seethingly whispers to Norris Wright, "Now, Major, you die," before driving the blade deep into his chest, killing him instantly. However, the fight is not over. Now, the body of Norris Wright collapses onto Bowie, pinning him to the ground, as Alfred Blanchard continues to try to inflict a mortal wound on his now trapped opponent. However, by this time, Bowie's friends have made their way to his aid. Now, Thomas Wells fires a shot that strikes Alfred Blanchard in the arm, just as Bowie is able to free himself and scramble to his feet. Bowie then manages to strike one final blow, a nasty gouge to Alfred Blanchard's side, before the melee is finally brought to a halt. In just under 90 seconds, Jim Bowie has incurred several life-threatening wounds, inflicted several himself, and managed to eradicate his longtime enemy. Now, as the effects of his adrenaline begin to fade, and the pain of his wounds sets in, Bowie is tended to by several of the physicians present. As the doctors work, Robert Crane, who had first shot Bowie, approaches. Though he had long sought to settle his score with Norris Wright, Bowie and Crane have had no prior history of confrontation nor violence. Now, Bowie calls out to Crane, "For God's sake, Crane, assist me, give me some water, and help me to the shade." Crane, having no personal animosity towards Bowie save for the last few minutes of combat, acquiesces to the request and brings Bowie water, before helping to carry him back to the shade of the island's willow trees. On their way to the trees, Bowie, grateful for the assistance, simply remarks, "Colonel Crane, you ought not to have shot me." In the end, 2 men, ironically, neither the appointed duelists for the day, are killed. From Bowie's party, General Samuel Cooney has died from the gunshot wound inflicted at the hands of Crane, while Major Norris Wright has fallen victim to the soon-to-be legendary blade of Jim Bowie. Alfred Blanchard has been badly injured by a gunshot and the knife wound that Bowie had struck as his final blow in the fight, but he will recover. For his part, Jim Bowie has been grievously injured. He is taken to Vidalia, Mississippi, where he spends 2 months recovering. In the interim, local newspapers begin to run the story of what would come to be known as the Sandbar Fight, already cementing the folkloric nature of Jim Bowie and his deadly knife. Though Bowie will recover, his story does not end here on the shores of the Mississippi. Bowie will go on to live nearly another decade, finally meeting his end at the hands of Santa Anna and the Mexican army in the legendary Battle of the Alamo. While the life of Jim Bowie is one replete with legend and controversy, for tonight, the many tales of his life, as well as the battle in which he died, are other stories for other times. Lincoln County, New Mexico, March 9, 1878. Dick Brewer's pale face displays a look of horrified shock as his horse nears the 3 fallen bodies of his prisoners. Motionless upon the earth in Blackwater Canyon lie Buck Morton, Frank Baker, and William McCloskey. Morton and Baker had been arrested by Brewer's posse just 3 days prior after a miles-long horse chase. They were issued a warrant by the Justice of the Peace on account of their involvement in the murder of John Tunstall. Tunstall was a friend and employer to many of the men in Brewer's party, having worked for the young Englishman at his cattle ranch. The cold-blooded execution of Tunstall was committed after the Lincoln County Sheriff William Brady sent a detachment of men to wrangle cattle from the Tunstall ranch on behalf of a debt owed by Brady's competitor and the business partner of John Tunstall, one Alexander McSween. McSween, a lawyer from St. Louis, had recently settled in Lincoln County with high ambitions. He endeavored to make a fortune for himself in the cattle and dry goods business in the profitable southern New Mexican mountains. The only issue with his lofty aspirations was the near monopoly on these interests held by Sheriff Brady and his partner, James Dolan. Tensions were present from the arrival of McSween and his British business partner, John Tunstall. Brady and Dolan, as well as the numerous men who were allied with them, profited from their cattle trade and their store, known simply as the House, and they were immediately leery about the bright-eyed newcomers attempting to carve out a piece of their pie. McSween would cross a red line that had set off a chain of hostile events sparking the Lincoln County War. A local resident hired McSween to represent them in the service of procuring a life insurance payout for a recently deceased family member. McSween would travel back east and spend several months' effort in securing the sizable payout of the insurance claim. However, the would-be recipient of the claim had also inherited a large debt to the house from the policyholder. If McSween were to deliver the payout to them, the money would almost entirely be going to help his competition. McSween, acting on business instincts instead of morals, withheld the payment to inflict damage upon Brady and Dolan as their legal efforts to come into possession of the funds played out. Sheriff Brady, a lawman with Irish roots and a temper as fierce as the Emerald Isle is green, gained a judgment from the court to attach McSween's property in service of the debt. And attach property he did, storming into McSween's office and selecting far more property than necessary to satisfy the debt. But the sheriff did not stop there. He sent a determined posse of his men to Tunstall's ranch to attach his cattle to the debt of McSween. Tunstall was not implicated in the ruling against McSween, but the sheriff sought to use this opportunity to make a clear statement to his advisers and inflict maximum damage upon them. John Tunstall approached the sheriff's posse alone as they descended upon his ranch, and was shot down with bitter indifference by Brady's men. Tunstall's men had been herding cattle and were attempting to catch up to Tunstall as he made his solo approach, but were only in time to see his still warm body lifeless upon the ground as the sun began to sink behind the mountains. The group of men would label themselves the Regulators, and they set out for vengeance on behalf of John Tunstall. They would even be deputized by the Justice of the Peace and capture Morton and Baker in early March. Dick Brewer had been the de facto leader of the party, but had faced a veritable mutiny as his men went against his wishes and executed Morton, Baker, and McCloskey as Brewer was attempting to return the men to Lincoln to stand trial for the crime against Tunstall. The Lincoln County War still stands as a timeless narrative that echoes forth from the ages of the Old West. It embodies within it many parables and much hard-learned wisdom, and as the escalations continued to mount, the truism that two wrongs don't make a right, and an eye for an eye would make the whole world blind, stand atop that list. The two deadly exchanges between bitter enemies of the war would not be where the hostilities ceased. The bodies of Baker, Morton, and McCloskey lay in what has come to be known as Dead Man's Draw. Brewer would enlist the help of New Mexican natives to bury them. The rest of the posse did not continue on to Lincoln with Brewer as he grimly rode into town to deliver the news and surrender himself. Brewer arrived in town on the 10th, just a day after McSween had returned himself. After seeking the counsel of his attorney companion, Brewer decided to face whatever legal ramifications were coming his way for his role in the Blackwater disaster, even if it meant his own death. The violence in the southern reaches of the territory had summoned the governor of New Mexico to travel to Lincoln and intercede, but the townspeople, hoping for an impartial authority to set their troubles at ease, would be further disappointed. Governor Axtell arrived in Lincoln on the morning of March 9th, and he spent just 3 hours investigating the matter that had gripped his southern territory, doing so while in the ever-present company of James Dolan. The governor deferred the opportunity to interview any neutral parties in the region, nor did he request a meeting with McSween to diplomatically attempt to find a resolution and bring about peace. As the citizen attempted to inform Axtell on the confluence of events that had led them to this precipitous situation, he simply demurred, "I know all about the matter and its cause, and I have already taken such action as I deem necessary." The governor's vague response to the citizen may be cleared up with his official decree. The primary action that would be taken by the governor on account of his trip to Lincoln, which would appear in the Cimarron News and Press on March 21, 1878, and contain, in part, the following. To the citizens of Lincoln County, the disturbed condition of affairs at the county seat brings me to Lincoln County at this time. My only object is to assist the good citizens to uphold the laws and keep the peace. First, John B. Wilson's appointment by the county commissioners as Justice of the Peace was illegal and void. Second, the appointment of Robert Weidman as U.S. Marshal has been revoked. Third, the President of the United States, Rutherford B. Hayes, upon an application made by me as Governor of New Mexico, has directed the post commander, Colonel Purington, to assist territorial civil officers in maintaining order and enforcing legal process. The governor's decree had retroactively undermined the efforts of the regulators to bring Tunstall's assailants to justice. By voiding John B. Wilson's appointments as Justice of the Peace, the warrants he issued for Morton and Baker were also vitiated, as well as his deputizing of the regulators. Now, the only officers of the court were Brady and his deputies, which included the remaining men who had carried out Tunstall's execution. The governor then went so far as to invoke the President of the United States to send a military intervention to the county to carry out the suppression efforts on behalf of Sheriff Brady. If Governor Axtell had intended to deliver a crushing blow to the citizens who were already working themselves into a rebellious fervor towards the county authorities, his effect had done just the opposite. After the one-sided proclamation and the disregard for the cold-blooded slaying of Tunstall, the time for relying upon the system to bring about justice was long over. Dick Brewer had learned of the governor's action from McSween upon his return, and his resolution to face the legal ramifications for what had occurred in Blackwater would be drastically altered. McSween instead instructed Brewer to give Lincoln County a, quote, wide berth until court was convened and there may be clarity brought to the issues plaguing the county. Brewer would leave during the night to his farm in Ruidoso. He would also deliver the message to all those who had been deputized that they were now essentially outlaws, stripped of all law enforcement abilities. On Monday the 11th, Alexander McSween fled Lincoln as well. He would take refuge in the town of Pecos, within John Chisholm's ranch. It was his plan to stay thereabouts until court had convened, then stand trial on embezzlement charges for his role in withholding the life insurance funds from his client. On the 13th, just 2 days after McSween's exit from Lincoln, the Jesse Evans gang would appear on the scene once more. The gang, now without members Baker and Morton, still boasted its namesake Jesse Evans, as well as his favored accomplice, Tom Hill. The outlaw gang had acted as mercenaries on behalf of Sheriff Brady in the death of John Tunstall, and had been hiding out in the Sacramento mountains. They moved down from their hideout towards Tularosa, and would come upon the camp of German sheep herder John Wagner. Jesse Evans and Tom Hill were at this point desperate for supplies and provisions. Wagner had been herding a flock of nearly 4,000 sheep from California en route to Concho County in Texas. He had made camp near Tularosa and was out with his flock when Evans and Hill descended into his camp. Only the driver of the wagon was present in the camp when the gang members began looting, and they were so focused on their objective that they failed to see Wagner approaching them alone as he returned to the camp. The elder herdsman grabbed a hold of a rifle belonging to Hill, which the intruder had left leaning upon a tree, and began firing with lethal intention upon the men. Tom Hill was immediately killed, and Jesse Evans was seriously wounded, having been shot twice, with one shot hitting him in the wrist and another penetrating his lungs. Improbable as it was, Evans managed to make an escape on horseback, riding into the night into the Oregon mountains, where he would reach Shedd's ranch and be given a welcome reception. Evans would hole up there for a few days, but his grave condition prompted him into turning himself into Fort Stanton, so he could be given care for his wounds, which he feared would soon become mortal. With Tom Hill, Baker, and Morton now dead, Jesse Evans would now have a story about the killing of Tunstall that would provide plenty of opportunities to scapegoat his expired companions. The recently removed U.S. Marshal Weidenman and Governor Axtell would publish contradictory letters in the New Mexican, a journal publication out of Santa Fe that took to attacking Weidenman on the governor's behalf. Their contention hinging on the fact that Weidenman had written a letter describing the events of Tunstall's slaying to an attorney friend in San Francisco, and that the contents held within the letter and its date showed that Weidenman had taken action he could not have been authorized to take, on account of the fact that the district court had not yet convened at that point to issue the warrants, and therefore the arrest could not have been carried out under the letter of the law at the time they were issued by Weidenman. The article delivered a rhetorical assault upon Weidenman and the regulators in an attempt to shift public opinion behind the governor and his course of action. It also painted a picture of the territory that was now under dispute, much of which stands true to this day. Quote, Lincoln is the southeast corner county of New Mexico. It is partly inhabited by Indians, the Mescalero Apache, who blows where he listeth, by Texas cattlemen, a few traders and businessmen, and a few skeleton companies of the United States troops. The letter provoked Weidenman to offer a rebuttal. Quote, the comments, like all others made by the gentlemanly editors, are full of Billingsgate and blatherskite. Mud and dirt are, as usual, freely thrown, and I with others am of the opinion that the editors unfortunately mistake their calling. Weidenman, clearly on the attack, proceeded to call into question not only the publication, but the actions of the lawmen of Lincoln County and the governor for their biased and myopic view of the violent late winter's war. A session of court had been announced for April 1st, though it was supposed to be scheduled for the 8th. Members of the regulators, acting independently of McSween as well as their recognized leader Dick Brewer, gathered near the court on the evening of March 31st in anticipation of the announced court session the following morning. Amongst them were Billy the Kid, Frank McNabb, Jim French, Fred Waite, Henry Middleton, and Henry Brown. They spent the evening at the Tunstall store, stoking one another's tempers and recollections of the recent injustices. Around 9 o'clock on the morning of the 1st, Sheriff Brady, along with several deputies and allies, walked from the Dolan store at the west end of town toward the courthouse. They informed prospective jurors that the court date had been announced in error and they would be convening the following Monday instead. As they walked through the town on their way to the court, they passed directly by Tunstall's store, doing so without incident. They then started to make their way back towards Dolan's headquarters. The corral at the rear of Tunstall's store was surrounded with high adobe walls with a narrow driveway on the east side of the building. The driveway had a wooden gate from which anyone approaching from the east could clearly be seen, but those approaching from the west could not be seen until they were right upon the gate, as the vantage point was blocked by the building that housed the Tunstall store. The regulators watched through this gate as Brady and his men walked back towards Dolan's store from the courthouse. Their group was scattered about, not walking in unison, when suddenly a series of rifle shots cut through the morning air. Brady fell at once, stopped dead in his tracks. Later, his recovered body would display at least a dozen bullet wounds. His deputy, George Heineman, was pierced by a single bullet, but after managing to stagger back a few steps in the direction of the courthouse, he fell dead as well, his last words a frightened plea for water. A bystander was shot just below the hip while hoeing an onion patch, but it was only a flesh wound. As Billy the Kid and French raced over to Brady's body, accounts vary as to their motives. Some assert that it was to recover the Kid's previously seized pistol, while others say that it was to take the arrest warrant Brady held for McSween. Nevertheless, Billy the Kid was then shot on the inside of his left thigh. The bullet that struck the Kid and also wounded French was fired by one Deputy Matthews, who had successfully taken cover amidst the fray of gunfire. The wound French received required him to briefly take refuge in the crawl space of a local citizen's home. Weidenman was in the corral where the gunfire emanated from, but claimed he was only there to feed Tunstall's dog. While perhaps true, it became a much derided alibi. Once the gunfire had ceased and the town had quieted, the regulators, aside from Billy the Kid, rode out of town. As they passed the outskirts of town, John Long fired 4 shots upon them from his rifle, one seriously wounding French. The regulators returned fire and made their escape. Billy the Kid's wound, while not serious, made horseback riding highly difficult, and he would make his own exit from town a couple of days later. The latest and most daring act of violence that had yet occurred in the Lincoln County War would bring to town Captain G.A. Purington and 25 soldiers from Fort Stanton. A town-wide search, door to door, was conducted for any remaining belligerents from the attacking party. Sheriff Brady was now dead. The governor's attempts to quell the mutinous fervor amongst the regulators had failed, and now even the military had been called in. 3 days after the attack on Brady and his men, the regulators headed southwest out of Lincoln. Brady's deputies and Captain Purington made a round of arrests. Unable to capture any of the 6 men who participated in the shooting, they went after Robert Weidenman, who admitted to being in the corral but not to being a party to the massacre. They also took McSween's brother-in-law, a man by the last name of Shield, into custody. McSween was arrested as soon as he arrived back in town, but McSween had brought to town with him an ally from Colorado, Dr. Montague R. Leverson, who had been staying at John Chisholm's ranch. Through his connections in the Hayes administration, he was able to put pressure upon prominent New York politicians regarding their dealings with McSween. McSween, Weidenman, and Shield were all taken to Fort Stanton. McSween's wife and allies stayed at the nearby trader's post to be available to lend their support. On April 4th, just 3 days after the death of Sheriff Brady, one of the most infamous gun battles of the Old West would occur at Blazer's Mill, a sawmill and trading post that supplied beef to the Mescalero Apache. It belonged to Dr. Joseph Hoy Blazer, an Indian affairs agent, and Blazer's wife ran a diner of sorts for travelers passing through. Dick Brewer and his men had stopped in at around 11 a.m. on that unseasonably warm spring day for lunch. As the regulators had passed through Ruidoso Valley, they had welcomed the addition of 5 new recruits, including Frank Coe and his cousin, George Coe. They piled into the Blazers' dining room, stacking their rifles against the wall, then gathered around a table awaiting their meal. Andrew Buckshot Roberts then rode up on his mule, leaving his pistol and cartridge belt as he made his way into the diner. But as he approached the front door, he caught a glimpse of several rifles stacked against the wall. He then retreated back to grab his own weapon. Roberts headed across the road to an office for the sawmill operated by Dr. Blazer. Roberts had been preparing to leave the country, but was waiting on some necessary letters to arrive there first. Buckshot Roberts was on the run because he had been a member of the posse that had shot down John Tunstall. As he made his way across the road, one of the regulators recognized him and cried out, "Here's Buck Roberts!" Brewer was still in possession of a warrant for his arrest. Before the men had a chance to take an easy shot at Roberts, Brewer called them to restrain themselves. Then, just as he had done with Morton and Baker, Brewer attempted to bring Buckshot Roberts in peacefully. Brewer would regret his decision. Brewer sent Frank Coe, who was well acquainted with Roberts, to persuade him to surrender peacefully. Roberts asked Coe to join him in Dr. Blazer's office to discuss the situation, but Coe declined, fearing he could be taken hostage. They instead sat on the doorstep of a wide room inside the adobe structure. Coe informed Roberts of the warrant they held, and that Brewer was guaranteeing his safety, and they only wanted to deliver him to the proper authorities. Naturally, Buckshot scoffed at this. "Surrender? Never. Never while I'm alive. Kid Antrim is with you and he would kill me on sight. Don't I know what happened to Morton and Baker?" The revenge killing of Morton and Baker in Blackwater County after their arrest by the regulators would make it nearly impossible for anyone to acquiesce to them peacefully. Add to that the assassination of Sheriff Brady, and the problem was even further compounded. Nevertheless, Coe continued to plead his case. Buckshot had earned his nickname because of his many hard battles with the natives, the Texas Rangers, and other wranglers and cowboys. He was not a large man by any measure, but he endured, in spite of having one arm crippled to the point he could not raise his rifle up to his shoulder. His body bore the scars of a hard-scrabble life on the frontier, and the prospect of squaring off in a shootout with 15-1 odds did not cause him to flinch. The regulators that were awaiting Robert's surrender grew restless, and after some time, Brewer sent George Coe, Henry Middleton, and Charles Beaudry over to attempt to arrest Roberts without incident. As Beaudry came upon the two men, he called out, "Roberts, throw up your hands!" Buckshot Roberts snarled back a defiant, "No!" and sprang up to his feet, but before he could fire off a round, Beaudry inflicted a gruesome gut shot to the wanted man. As the abdomen of Roberts flailed with agonizing intensity, he pushed through the door of the office, then threw a mattress over the doorway to barricade himself within. Through his covered position, he began to send out returning fire. His first shot cut the belt directly off the waist of Charles Beaudry. The next struck George Coe directly in his trigger finger as he went to fire his gun, severing the digit just above the knuckle, a 1 in a million shot delivered with cinematic perfection. The third shot pierced the chest of Henry Middleton, inflicting a serious wound to his lungs, and, as if he were a magnet for non-lethal gunshot injuries, another round grazed the arm of Billy the Kid. If they had any designs on waiting out Roberts to expend his ammunition, they would be disappointed. It was revealed to them that the office he had taken refuge in also housed Dr. Blazer's Springfield rifle and over 1,000 rounds of ammunition. Dick Brewer then managed to regain order of his men. He instructed them to stay out of the line of fire, and that he would take up a position to see into the doorway where Roberts was holed up within. He crossed the road and took cover behind the protection of some sizable logs lying upon the ground near the sawmill. As Brewer slowly rose his head above the lumber, Roberts saw the hat rising over the top of the logs. Roberts took aim just below the brim of the hat and fired. Brewer was struck by a bullet square between the eyes and fell dead at once. The regulators could do nothing but watch in stunned horror from their position. Brewer had been their leader through good times and bad, and with varying degrees of efficacy, but his abrupt loss had thrown the party into total disarray. The men deserted the area without even attempting to recover the body of their fallen leader. They retreated to George Coe's residence on the Ruidoso River. Back at Blazer's mill, Buckshot Roberts was so gravely wounded through the stomach that Dr. Blazer had sent for the surgeon at Fort Stanton, but Roberts could not be saved. He passed the following day, and was buried in a grave directly adjacent to the one that had been freshly dug for Dick Brewer. Alexander McSween would soon learn of the events at Blazer's mill, and send an account of the events to the Cimarron News and Press, published on April 18th. McSween relayed the events of the two shooting incidents, the wounds to Buckshot Roberts as well as to his allied men, and the death of their leader. He would eulogize Brewer in the statement, quote, "Richard M. Brewer was one of nature's noble men, physically faultless, generous to a fault, a giant in friendship, possessing an irreproachable character and unsullied honor. Kind, amiable, and gentle in disposition, he has fallen early into the 3x6 promised him 18 months ago. Murderers and horse thieves hated him. Their friends hated him. But the people, Mexican and American, held him in the highest possible esteem." The loss of Brewer was not just the death of an honorable man in an increasingly violent and unnecessary conflict. It represented the loss of order within the roughshod rank and file of the regulators. Brewer presented an outwardly civil and organized face to the public in regards to the group. The remaining members could be considered to be varying degrees of law-abiding, with some being downright despised. The vacant sheriff position would be filled by John Copeland, who was appointed as Sheriff Brady's successor, but after a short time, it was ascertained that he would not be wholly favorable towards Murphy and Dolan's interests, opting instead for a neutral position in an effort to restore peace to Lincoln. Copeland would eventually be relieved of his command and replaced by George Pepin. George Pepin was one of Brady and Dolan's oldest allies in the territory. Pepin was easily swayed. He exhibited a relatively weak demeanor, certainly in comparison to Brady, and could be instructed to do the bidding of the House complicitly. Sheriff Pepin would continue the use of deputized members of the Murphy-Dolan faction, including Jesse Evans, who was also a suspect in the death of John Tunstall. Along with the Jesse Evans gang already aggressive involvement, the Seven Rivers Warriors began posturing to make a move in the ongoing Lincoln County conflict. News came out of Roswell, at the time just a small 2 or 3 house settlement 60 miles east of Lincoln. The crux of the matter was the favorable court ruling McSween had won the month prior. A letter was published in the Las Vegas Gazette on April 28th, written by one Marion Turner. Quote, "As far as legal proceedings are concerned, the difficulties in Lincoln County were settled on the 15th of this month. The change to the grand jury by Judge Bristol was denunciatory in the action of McSween and laudatory to the opposite party, the head of which is supposed to be Major Murphy and the firm of J.J. Dolan and Company. My firm belief is that although the adherents of these parties have been guilty in, quote, killing their enemies, there was no murder in the matter, but a contest for, quote, the best of the fight." Turner was clearly unhappy with the result that favored McSween, but even beyond that, he attempted to reframe Lincoln County violence as being a byproduct of war and not actions that were subjectable to laws of homicide and mayhem. The, quote, Pecos men, the Seven Rivers Warriors, also took umbrage with a statement by Dick Brewer's successor as leader of the Regulators, Frank McNabb. McNabb had made a statement after the favorable McSween ruling that the Regulators intended to, quote, close out all who had been involved with cattle wrangling in Lincoln County. The Seven Rivers people were notorious for their cattle thievery. McNabb said that they would soon come down to, quote, clean them up. One of the Seven Rivers Warriors' loudest voices rebuked this, stating, "What do they think we are, a pack of mice?" On the 29th, the Seven Rivers Warriors had reached the location of the Fritz Ranch, roughly 8 miles south of Lincoln. There were 35 men in total. With them was George Pepin and several other Murphy-Dolan loyalists. Frank McNabb, Frank Coe, and Ab Sanders were traveling after dinner in Lincoln towards their farm in Hondo. As they rounded a bend, they were spotted by a detachment of the Seven Rivers Warriors men, who had recognized the Regulators at once, as McNabb had stood out to them. In unison, McNabb, Coe, and Sanders were fired upon. McNabb was mortally wounded. His recovered body would exhibit numerous bullet holes. Sanders fell from his steed. He had survived, but was terribly wounded himself. Coe had jumped from his horse and managed to come away unscathed. He would scurry into a recess in the hillside and keep up a continuous fire until running out of munitions. Coe then surrendered under the assurance that his life would be spared, and, as he was not the primary target, which Frank McNabb had been, he acquiesced. Coe was taken to Fort Stanton to be treated for his wounds. The Seven Rivers Warriors men then descended upon Lincoln under the cover of night, stationing themselves within the Dolan store. They stated that they wanted to be granted permission to deliver the same frontier justice to Alexander McSween and his adherents that they had wrought upon Sheriff Brady. One Captain Saturnino Baca refused to be party to this murderous scheme. The Seven Rivers men spent the night in town and conspired to make an attack, but when dawn arrived and illuminated the town of Lincoln, they saw Ellis's place, tightly shut and guarded. Within were several McSween allies, armed and ready for battle. The Seven Rivers men instead opted to offer their help to Sheriff Copeland to make arrests for those involved in the death of Sheriff Brady and Deputy Hindman. Upon receiving this correspondence, Copeland sent word to Fort Stanton that soldiers were needed in town to prevent the outbreak of violence between the two mobilizing factions. George Coe had been stationed atop the roof of the Ellis store. and he took a shot at one of the Seven Rivers men in his line of sight. The man he shot turned out to be Charlie Kruling, known familiarly as Dutch Charlie. The shot struck him in the ankle, shattering the bone. The two opposing sides then began firing upon one another, and as the town was on the precipice of civil war, 14 soldiers arrived from Fort Stanton to put an end to the skirmish, at least for the time being. But the decisive battles to come in the battle for Lincoln County are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Northern France, April 21st, 1918. In the chill of a new spring morning, Manfred von Richthofen forces himself to open his tired eyes, having suffered through yet another restless night of fitful sleep and unsettling nightmares. He is 25 years old, and already one of the most well-known men in the whole of the country, if not the whole of Europe. In the midst of the horrors of World War I, he has risen to celebrity status as a symbol of hope for Germany. As millions of German young men have marched off to the horrors of the muddy trenches, with many never returning, and as the tide of the war has begun to move against the central powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey, Richthofen has been presented to the German public as a gallant knight of the air. As Germany's premier ace fighter pilot, with an astonishing 80 confirmed kills in the skies over the vast Western Front, Richthofen's image of a clean-cut, fearless young daredevil in a sleek red Fokker triplane is presented to the wartime public in an attempt to obfuscate the horrors and futility of the battles being waged on the ground in favor of what was thought to be a more chivalrous approach to combat in the new deadly art of one-on-one dogfights in the skies above the battlefields. Only miles away from where Richthofen now stirs awake on the battlefields of the Somme, some of the most brutal fighting the world had ever seen had unfolded in the preceding year. Countless soldiers on both sides had met brutal ends in endless artillery barrages, head-on charges, gas attacks, and hand-to-hand fighting in the flooding, stinking trenches that lined the 400-mile-long Western Front. Stuck in the filth and gore of the war on the ground, many a young soldier glanced skywards at their airborne compatriots with some measure of envy for what appeared to be a more genteel existence. But, in fact, in the first war in which the airplane will be employed, the inverse has proven to be true over the past 3 very dangerous and very deadly years. Scarcely more than a decade has passed between the Wright brothers' first successful flight of the Kitty Hawk in 1903 and the outbreak of World War I in Europe. Planes were not only a new technology, their evolution from an airborne reconnaissance platform to offensive fighters and bombers had happened as the carnage of the trenches unfolded beneath them. Initially, encounters of rival pilots in the air had been, in fact, quite congenial, with a gentlemanly respect being afforded by each for their respective enemy. However, within a matter of weeks, potshots were being traded with rifles and shotguns. In the months after this, both sides of the conflict had worked furiously to develop a way to outfit the increasingly powerful and agile fighter planes with machine guns that could be fired accurately by a pilot in flight without damaging his own aircraft. It would be German flight engineer Anthony Fokker who would pioneer the use of an interrupter gear that would pause the plane's whirling propellers just long enough for a burst of gunfire before initiating the propeller again. This advancement was soon copied by the British and the French, and soon pilots in the skies over Europe were pioneering techniques and tactics to hunt down, engage, and kill their enemy in an arena which mankind had never conducted warfare before. Though the prevailing thought among the public at large is that the technology employed and distance between combatants must assuredly result in a more civilized fight, the death rates of pilots surpasses even those in the front lines of the trenches. By 1918, the average life expectancy of a fighter pilot on either side is little more than 2 weeks, and this is not counting the number killed in training. The world of the World War I fighter pilot is one in which winner-take-all, life and death contests are often waged multiple times a day, for weeks or even months on end. In comparison to their cohorts serving on the ground, however, pilots of the First World War lived in a maddening contrast of violence and luxury. While the men on the front lines are relegated to the confines of the trenches and must subsist on rations of crackers and canned meat, pilots on both sides enjoy the comfort of personal quarters, soft beds, hot meals, as well as beer, wine, spirits, and often no shortage of cigars. Men like Manfred von Richthofen have managed not only to survive in this terrifyingly dualistic, intensely consequential way of life, but to thrive in it. Even amongst his most auspicious peers, Richthofen stands out for both his accomplishments and his dedication. Though the British press has only recently begun to release the names of their celebrated ace pilots, meaning a fighter pilot who has managed to accrue 5 verified kills in combat, the German press has pushed Richthofen and a number of his fellow pilots as vaunted heroes, dedicated to the glory and victory of the Rhineland. Richthofen has risen to command his own flight of pilots, all flying the new Fokker triplane, a highly complex and maneuverable aircraft painted in a variety of bright colors and designs. The group presents a garish spectacle to the unknowing eye, and has been dubbed Richthofen's Flying Circus. But their business at hand is deathly serious, and it weighs heavily on the mind of Richthofen, whose body and psyche have begun to accrue the wear and tear of numerous injuries, countless close calls, and untold instances of witnessing death from an up-close and personal perspective. Roughly a year earlier, he had been hit with machine gun fire that had torn a 4-inch wound in his head. He had managed to fly back to base and land on pure instinct alone, but had suffered a severe concussion. Ever since, he had been plagued by headaches, dark moods, and an ever-growing sense of foreboding. The thrill of the chase and the kill had been replaced with a sickening sense of self-loathing. He feels himself, in some sense, cursed by his own talents. Though he continues to fly, despite repeated admonishments to retire from his officers and family alike, he does so solely in the hopes of keeping more of his countrymen alive. Every plane he shoots down now seems to afflict him with an unshakable nausea, and haunt his dreams at night as he attempts to rest in the private quarters he keeps, usually accompanied only by his beloved Great Dane, Moritz. However, the odd duality of his vocation still manages to manifest itself in shows of Richthofen's personal pride and his abilities as a hunter. Raised in a home of esteemed military men, a favorite family pastime had been hunting the many elk and boar that populated the family's estate. Much like his family's home, Richthofen's barracks are decorated with his most prized hunting trophies. The head of a moose and a boar, respectively, adorn the wall across the room from his bed, reminders of a simpler life. But it is the dozens of metal plates and strips of canvas adorning the walls, all stamped or emblazoned with serial numbers, that draws the most intense glares of curiosity, and perhaps even concern, from any of the all-too-rare visitors who find themselves invited inside. Each has been pried by Richthofen himself off of the many planes he has shot down. Hanging from the ceiling, casting a perpetually disconcerting series of shadows about the dimly lit, macabrely decorated room, is a chandelier made of a downed plane's engine block retrofitted to hold a number of electric light bulbs in something reminiscent of a steampunk chandelier. As Richthofen sits on his bed, putting on his boots and wiping the sleep from his eyes, his spirits are briefly lifted at the thought of his upcoming hunting trip with the wealthy father of one of his pilot friends. In a mere 14 days' time, Richthofen's tenure in the skies of World War I will officially come to an end. The high command of the German military are worried that the already suffering German morale might collapse entirely should their most well-known hero be shot down and killed. Richthofen is conflicted about finally walking away from his profession, but looking forward to a reprieve from the constant chaos of combat. Then, he is momentarily distracted, as the corner of his vision is teased with the glint of the light reflecting off 6 small silver cups, all meticulously arranged on a table to his right. Ever since September 1916, when he had scored his first aerial victory, he had commissioned a silversmith in Berlin to craft a small silver cup for every dogfight he had won. However, after his 60th cup was completed, Richthofen was informed by the jeweler that he would no longer be able to complete his order due to the silver shortage brought on by the war. It seems that, upon close inspection, every inch of the pilot's living quarters are adorned with the spoils of his victories. His table and chairs are constructed from propellers taken off of a downed French aircraft, and his shelves and walls are adorned with weapons and instruments pulled from the aircraft of vanquished foes. The year prior, in 1917, while convalescing from his head wound, Richthofen had dictated an autobiography to a female German writer, and the heavily redacted work had been published by the German military in hopes of boosting public morale. The Manfred von Richthofen that is so known and beloved by the German public is the premier example of patriotic fortitude, personal bravery, and fraternal commitment. However, despite having barely reached his mid-20s, Richthofen feels himself an old man, living on borrowed time. Though he had been brought up in military academies and trained as a cavalryman, he had built his strongest friendships among his fellow pilots as they trained and fought together. Now, 4 years into the war, nearly all of the men whom he had been taught by and trained with are dead, shot down by British and French pilots like those whose memories are preserved by the trophies on Richthofen's wall. In his mind, Richthofen is part of a vicious cycle that is likely inescapable. Still, he and everyone around him know he is among the best, if not the best, in the world at what he does. And thus, Richthofen continues to fly and continues to kill. Death for pilots on either side was a terrifying, grisly prospect. Were a pilot or gunner not killed outright, they would be faced with the unenviable dilemma of jumping to their deaths or burning alive until the cockpit slammed into the earth. Some unfortunate souls were not even afforded this choice and found themselves consumed in hellish fireballs that fell to the earth with sickening speed and ferocity. Parachutes were not allowed by either side for the majority of the war, as it was a prevailing opinion amongst commanders that affording pilots a means of escape would only serve to encourage acts of cowardice and desertion. For pilots on either side during the First World War, flying into combat is a zero-sum game from the moment their wheels leave the ground. Either they will return their aircraft and land safely, or they will die. Squadrons are often sent out on multiple missions a day, and the incessant grind on the nerves soon becomes apparent in even the most competent, seasoned aviators. A common nightmare reported amongst pilots is that of being caught in a burning cockpit, covered in fuel and smothered in flesh-scorching flames, only to awaken from their nightmare just before their aircraft smashes into the ground. As the days of flying, killing, and losing comrades carry on, each surviving man manages to find his own way to cope with the stresses of such an existence. Some take solace in drinking and singing with their fellow pilots during the night, some in their Bibles. Richthofen, for his part, keeps almost entirely to himself, decompressing by playing his violin, riding his bike, and spending time with Moritz, the Great Dane. Though the strain of this existence becomes more and more evident on the men with every passing day, business carries on. Thus, Richthofen, the man in command of this squadron, finishes lacing up his boots and heads out of the door of his quarters, bidding Moritz a fond farewell. Heading to the aerodrome, where the mechanics and flight crews work doggedly to prepare the aircraft for flight, Richthofen meets with the men of the flying circus, themselves all weary and sleep-starved, and reviews the objectives for that day's mission. As they have countless times before over the preceding weeks, the flying circus, officially known as Yasta 11, would fly over the Somme River in pursuit of British observation planes. With the German army launching a massive spring offensive campaign in what amounts to a last-ditch effort to salvage their hopes at an advantageous end to the war for the Central Powers, the men of Yasta 11 are critical in providing reconnaissance and air support for the troops on the ground. One difference today, though, will be the addition of a new pilot, the 23-year-old Wolfram von Richthofen, a cousin to Manfred. Also flying with Yasta 11 is Manfred's brother, Lothar von Richthofen, himself a veteran pilot with a plethora of combat kills to his name. Manfred von Richthofen, for all of his vaunted celebrity status as a fearless fighter pilot, is in fact a calculating, strategically minded man, reticent to take any risk that needlessly endangers his life, or, especially, the lives of his men. He instructs his young cousin to merely observe the day's action. Under no circumstances is he to engage the enemy in offensive action. Lothar is given no such admonition, though Manfred has made it clear on several previous occasions that his younger brother should be less cavalier in his own engagements. Once the pre-flight checks are complete and the final cigarettes are enjoyed, the men of Richthofen's flying circus, their Fokker aircraft painted in ostentatious color schemes, take to the skies and head west in pursuit of the British. At roughly 10:45 a.m., two RE-8s, the British reconnaissance planes they are on the hunt for, are spotted not far from the Moorlancourt Ridge. The aircraft are engaged, but Richthofen and his pilots are unsuccessful in shooting them down. Just as the Germans are disengaging from their attempt at downing the RE-8s, they are suddenly met by several members of the 209th Squadron of the Royal Air Force, commanded by Canadian Captain Arthur Roy Brown. The 209th have themselves been out that morning in pursuit of German reconnaissance aircraft, and are as surprised to see Richthofen and his flying circus as they are the 209th. However, in mere moments, the surprise of the occasion dissipates, and a life-or-death fight ensues. Captain Roy Brown is, himself, guarding a new pilot on one of his first missions, a close childhood friend named Walter Reed May. Being a neophyte pilot, May has been instructed by Brown, much in the same fashion as Richthofen has instructed his young cousin, to steer clear of any engagements with the German aircraft. However, when May spots a Fokker triplane seeming to move slightly slower than the rest, he cannot help himself, and his better judgment wanes as he pursues the German pilot. The German pilot in question is Wilfried von Richthofen, the young cousin Manfred had instructed to stay out of the fight. However, with May now fast approaching from his rear, the young Wilfried is forced to take evasive action. This act catches the eye of Manfred, who, seeing his young cousin in trouble, dives down into the fray in order to assist him. The elder von Richthofen now tails the terrified young May, who now dives his Sopwith Camel, the famed British fighter plane, below the cloud cover, following the course of the River Somme. Manfred von Richthofen follows in close pursuit, intending to dispatch the troublesome young pilot who is chased after his young cousin. But, to his own horror, he finds that his machine guns have jammed. This critical malfunction means that after firing any burst, the weapons have to be cleared before continuing to fire. Still, Manfred presses on, attempting to get as close as possible to his opponent in order to mitigate his compromised rate of fire. The pair zoom over the village of Vaux-sur-Somme, narrowly missing the town's high church steeple. As the chase unfolds in the air, Australian soldiers on the ground look on in equal parts awe and indignity. As their ally in May attempts to zigzag his Sopwith Camel in hopes of shaking Richthofen from his pursuit, The soldiers on the ground begin to take pot shots at the red triplane, now ensconced deep behind enemy lines. Rory Brown, as well, attempts to assist his friend and comrade, diving down to the deck in pursuit of Richthofen. As the aircraft zoom back towards Moreland Court Ridge, zooming over the top of the imposing embankment, Richthofen suddenly sees the precarious nature of his positioning between May and Brown, and now veers right with the intention of heading back towards the German lines. However, as he makes his turn, the men on the ground, taking shots with rifles and machine guns, see the aircraft begin to lurch, and then sputter. Then, suddenly, the red Fokker triplane rapidly descends from the sky at a sickeningly steep angle. Richthofen has been hit in the torso and is now bleeding profusely. He attempts to pull his aircraft into a crash landing, but the plane takes a violent nosedive when the landing gear catch the ground, sending the propeller into the earth and destroying the front of his plane. Richthofen is slammed forward, his head plowing into the back of his machine guns and instrument panel, disfiguring and bloodying his freshly shaven face. Several Australian soldiers rush to the downed aircraft, but it is too late. The legendary Manfred von Richthofen is dead. By some accounts, some of the soldiers are said to have heard him mutter the pitiable word "kaput" before expiring, but this has never been fully verified. While it is initially reported that the ace pilot Roy Arthur Brown is responsible for dealing the fatal shot that finally dispatched the vaunted German ace, later reports seem to confirm that it was in fact an Australian machine gunner who killed the legendary pilot. The soldier believed most likely to have fired the consequential bullet is Sergeant Cedric Popkin of the 24th Machine Gun Company, though other reports hold that either W.J. Snowy Evans, a Lewis machine gunner with the 53rd Battery, 14th Field Artillery Brigade, Royal Australian Artillery, or Gunner Robert Buey, also 53rd Battery, are the soldiers who should be credited. Regardless of who killed him, Manfred von Richthofen's body is laid to rest by the Australian soldiers with full military honors, a tribute almost unthinkably rare at this point in the war, in the village of Bertangles, near Amiens, on the 22nd of April, 1918. Though his tombstone reads, Manfred von Richthofen, in a few short months he will be known to the world by the moniker the Red Baron, an English translation of the German word Freiherr, which the German press had commonly used to refer to the nobility-born Richthofen. Though he never knew the name in life, history remembers the Red Baron as a symbol of the new wave of modern warfare that would now be waged not only on the land and the sea, but in the skies. Tragically, the war to end all wars would carry on for another 6 months, with tens of thousands more soldiers and civilians alike losing their lives in the mere interest of a few yards of ground. At 11 o'clock in the morning, on November 11th, 1918, the Great War would officially come to an end. In the end, an estimated 20 million people would be dead, with another 21 million wounded. The face of the world and the nature of war had been changed forever, for better or for worse. And while men like Manfred von Richthofen saw their lives tragically cut short, as did millions on either side, their stories are all worthy of solemnity and reverence. Unfortunately, the many tales of violence and valor that took place in the Great War are, for tonight, other stories for other times. January 17th, 1781, Cherokee County, South Carolina. Just before sunrise, Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton led a column of men, some 1,150 strong, through the Carolina hills directly into the waiting lines of American Brigadier General Daniel Morgan. A highly confident Tarleton was prepared to unleash a furious assault of infantry, cannon, and cavalry upon the much despised Morgan and his ragged yet cunning band of resistance fighters. What Bannister was not aware of was that Morgan had foreseen this move from the British and had prepared his men in a series of defensive lines, utilizing the varied elevation of the landscape to hide the main body of his forces. They were under orders to execute Morgan's masterful plan of drawing the British in with a line of militiamen as bait, then consuming the king's forces as a series of encirclements that could earn the brigadier general the moniker American Hannibal, but only if things went according to plan. Daniel Morgan was born in Hunterdon County, New Jersey, in the mid-1730s. The son of Welsh parents, he left home at the tender age of 17 after a quarrel with his father. With a quick temper and a strong resolve, confrontation was rooted in the core of Morgan's being. He would spend a few years working as a teamster on the frontier, eventually buying his own wagons, and would even be contracted to work for the British during the French and Indian War. After the failed Braddock expedition came to a deadly end at the Battle of the Monongahela, Morgan took exception with his treatment by a British officer and slapped the head of the royally commissioned soldier. In response, upon their arrival back from the battle, Morgan was sentenced to 500 lashes with a cat o' nine tails. Daniel Morgan stood defiantly as he was scourged, counting along with the British during every flesh-tearing blow. The punishment, while usually fatal, would fail to put an end to the pugnacious frontiersman. The heartless damnation he had been handed down would, however, instill in him a relentless detestation for his British antagonizers and the Crown's treatment for their colonial subjects. Upon the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, Morgan would finally be given the opportunity to engage in his long-sought retribution. The Virginia Commonwealth raised 2 companies to send to Boston, one of which was led by Captain Daniel Morgan. His contingent of 96 frontiersmen were no greenhorns. They were a seasoned unit that had become well-versed in low-intensity skirmishes during Dunmore's War. They would adopt a style of woodland combat they had learned from the natives, and would soon earn the name Morgan's Riflemen. The Kentucky long rifles they carried, with their spiral-grooved barrels, could knock down a target 300 yards away. Seeking to inflict maximum damage, Morgan gave orders to his men to target British officers. They did so with such devastating success, it drew the ire of not only the British, but also that of the American Commander-in-Chief, George Washington, who felt the approach was too undignified. Morgan would see significant action in the early years of the Revolutionary War, even being captured in Canada, and when offered a pardon were he to swear his allegiance to the king, he coolly replied, "Do not insult me again." He would later be freed in a prisoner exchange. Upon his release, George Washington would petition Congress to promote Morgan, writing he would recommend to the particular notice of Congress Captain Daniel Morgan, a good and valuable officer, a fit and proper person to succeed. Morgan was given the rank of colonel, and his men would play a crucial role in the American victory at Saratoga. While the early years of the war were highlighted by significant battles throughout the northern colonies, many of which were commanded in the field by General George Washington, in 1780, the Southern theater would rise to increasing prominence. Major General Charles Cornwallis was a fixture of the early British campaigns during the onset of the war in the Northeast, this success coming after a failed siege of Charleston under General Clinton in 1776. In November 1778, Cornwallis returned to England to tend to his ailing wife. She would pass that winter, and the British general would return to America and serve under Clinton once again, this time with designs on successfully capturing Charleston and then conquering the American South. In May 1780, the British would achieve their long-sought conquering of the coastal South Carolina town. After 6 long weeks of being under siege, Major General Benjamin Lincoln would surrender, along with 5,500 men and every one of their sloops, schooners, and frigates. It was one of the worst American defeats in the entirety of the war. September 1780 would see an uptick of movements throughout the South. At Hillsborough, Brigadier General Horatio Gates took command of an extremely depleted force. The 2 regiments that made up the main body of the Southern lines amounted to only 1,241 men, just over 900 of which were infantry. Morale was extremely low, even for the depressed standards of the Continental Army. In the north, Washington's army had its most recent engagement at Monmouth Courthouse in the spring of 1778. A strategic draw, Clinton would take the British into New York City, where they would entrench themselves in defensive positions, with their naval superiority commanding the shores around them. 2.5 years of stalemate had now passed, with Washington unwilling to lay siege to the impenetrable Empire City, and Clinton unwilling to pursue his foe and leave his advantageous stronghold. Major John Andre, an aide-de-camp to General Clinton, was captured with documents on his person signed by West Point commander Benedict Arnold. It was discovered that Arnold had been cooperating with the British for over a year. Andre would be hanged for his part in the malfeasance, but Benedict Arnold would escape and go on to become the most notorious turncoat and saboteur in American history. As Cornwallis brought his army to Charlotte that month, he fashioned his plans for garnering total control of the southern United States. Cornwallis sent troops north to Salisbury after he captured the Queen City, throwing North Carolina into a fit of hysteria, as the state legislators scrambled to come up with a solution to the royal encroachment. Horatio Gates knew his men were scarcely capable of standing toe-to-toe with Cornwallis's sizable force, but there were possible advantages the Americans held that he sought to exploit. First, a hit-and-run, antagonistic style of guerrilla raids could be used to weaken their enemy. This could allow for the Americans to increase morale, achieve small strategic victories, and avoid the bulk of their forces being captured, as had been the case at Charleston. Additionally, the irregular hill country of the Carolinas was little known to the British High Command. The varied topographical landscape could hold the key to delivering the Americans the upper hand. It just so happened that Horatio Gates had the perfect man to undertake both of these elements of fighting on behalf of the Americans. Daniel Morgan, the hard-fighting, hard-drinking gambler from Winchester, Virginia, was the picturesque embodiment of the rugged individualism that bore itself from the American frontier. Morgan was not one to be subjugated or talked down to. His temper had most recently flared up when a fellow officer spoke poorly of General Washington. Morgan came to the defense of, quote, His Excellency. Though the differences between the commander-in-chief and Daniel Morgan were vast, a mutual respect persisted amongst the two patriots. While Morgan had fervently sought a promotion in rank, he'd been repeatedly passed over. Gates sought to place Morgan with the North Carolina militia, yet his rank as a colonel in the Continental Army meant that others in the detachment could outrank him and subject him to their orders. Similar it was to George Washington's experience in the French and Indian War as a Virginia militia colonel seeking a royal officer commission. To remedy this, Morgan was given his long-desired rank of brigadier general. Done as something of a formality, Gates and Morgan could have hardly dreamt that this administrative decision would soon shape American history and alter the course of the young nation's quest for independence. Morgan was then given his own detachment to carry out his asymmetrical operation. 3 companies of Continental Infantry, 60 Virginia riflemen, and 70 cavalry that included the small body of dragoons led by William Washington, cousin to the top American general. The British had gone into their winter quarters in Winnsboro, South Carolina, allowing Morgan's brigade valuable time to organize and provision themselves, but their task would not wait until the spring to be carried out. Among the harassment offered to the British by Morgan's men that winter would be perhaps the most unlikely and comical victory for their unorthodox crusade. Colonel William Washington had left the sick in his camp, with tents up and campfires alight, to give the illusion that they still occupied it should any British pickets scout it out. Then he took his cavalry regiment, using an indirect backwoods path, to the garrison of Henry Rugeley. Washington secured the surrender of Rugeley and his men using only a pine knot and a brilliant bit of posturing. Otho Williams recounted the farcical success in his journal. It seems that Colonel Washington humorously ordered his men to plant the trunk of an old pine tree in the manner of a field piece, pointing towards the garrison, at the same time dismounting some of his men to appear as an infantry. Displaying his cavalry to the best advantage, he sent a corporal of dragoons to summon the commanding officer to an immediate surrender, no doubt insisting that once the American artillery opened fire, Mr. Rugeley's fort would be reduced to little more than splinters and the garrison flattened. 103 British surrendered to Colonel Washington without a single shot fired. Nathaniel Greene was selected by George Washington to be the commander of the southern department of the Continental Forces. Greene chose to divide his army, placing part of them under the command of Morgan. Additions to his detachment now included 400 soldiers from Delaware and Maryland, as well as several from the Virginia militia. Militia from South Carolina would be added to his forces before New Year's. Greene had tasked Morgan with guarding a territory to the southwest of Charlotte to protect its citizens and to forage the area. Cornwallis received word of Morgan's location and feared it threatened his men. He ordered Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton to attack their position and prevent the nearby British Fort 96 from falling under siege by the Americans. Tarleton, the spry 26-year-old officer, would head out on the night of January 16th, with a single column reinforced by the men of the 96. American scouts delivered word to Morgan of the British advance, and Morgan retreated to the north with his men. He selected his desired battlefield location for strategic and psychological benefit. The grass-covered knolls of the locale known as Hannah's Cowpens, and its placement between the Pacolet River to their front and the Broad River to their rear, would ensure that the quick-to-retreat militiamen would have no easy exit, forcing them to stand and fight. Positioning his men between the two streams was not the only adjustment Morgan would make regarding the inexperienced segment of his forces. His plan would face his militia front and center, suspecting that the British would attack them head-on. This front line of novice troops would invariably break and begin to fall back. Morgan had designs on just that happening. The American general had placed his Continentals on the hill that the militia would retreat up, out of sight of the British. Colonel Washington's dragoons would be laying in wait behind the second line, with a detachment of pickets placed on the American right. The night before the battle, Daniel Morgan gave an impassioned speech to his men. He removed his shirt and showed the grisly, spider-webbed scars that canvassed the flesh of his back and shoulders from his lashing. The ruthless and unforgiving nature of the British was emphasized, and the troops were implored to follow their orders to a letter, and that if they did so, a great victory for the Americans would be won. Before dawn on January 17th, Daniel Morgan watched from atop a hill the movements of Banastre Tarleton and his British column. Morgan bellowed out in his deep, booming voice, "Get up! Banny's coming!" The men grabbed their rifles and took their positions, then waited for the oncoming storm. Morgan rode down to the militia that comprised the front line, giving specific orders to the men not to fall back to the hill until they had delivered 2 volleys to the British at close range. Tarleton attempted to ascertain the distribution and stature of the American position that morning, but his failure to properly reconnoiter his adversary and the haste at which he had led his men into battle would prove utterly disastrous. Lieutenant Roderick Mackenzie of the 71st Regiment would recount the failures of Tarleton. Without the delay of a single moment, and despite of extreme fatigue, the Light Legion infantry and fusiliers were ordered to form in line. Before this order was put into execution, Major Newmar, who commanded the latter corps, posting his officers, the line far from incomplete, was led to the attack by Lieutenant Colonel Tarleton himself. Impatient and overconfident, Tarleton could not even await the proper deployment of his infantry before leading them forward into what, for virtually all of them, very soon amounted to death, injury, or capture. Once the British advance was within shooting range of the American front line, the South Carolina militia let loose a devastating opening salvo. Several British officers were targeted by the militia and were killed just as the battle had begun. The British then answered back with their own round of fire. The Crown muskets aimed high and did little damage to the militia. While Morgan had explicitly ordered the front line to fire 2 volleys before falling back to the position of the hidden Continentals, most began to retreat after the British offered their retort, with the cavalry covering for their withdrawal. The British light infantry made their charge, with bayonets fixed. The militia who had not fallen back then delivered their second shot, stunning the British advance and stopping them cold. The American Continentals took staggered steps between their lines to facilitate absorbing the retreating militia into their ranks. This nuance was put in place ahead of time by Morgan, who had exhaustively planned his vision for the battle down to every conceivable detail. The British, emboldened by the sight of their fleeing enemy, disregarded protocol and gave chase, breaking from their usually disciplined formation. As they crested the hill, salivating at the prospect of a day soon to be won, they locked eyes on the main body of the Continental Army that stood waiting to receive them. The stunned British had little time to react, as a torrential fire was opened upon them from just yards away. They were cut down wholesale, with staggering numbers of casualties inflicted. The third line of the Americans could only listen as the agonizing cries of their foe and the blistering sound of the musket fire consumed the air as they waited. Tarleton, aghast at what he had delivered his troops into, quickly attempted to course-correct and sent his dragoons to hunt down the fleeing militia that had not fallen back to the Continental's position, and the British cavalry soon fell upon them as their sabers glittered above their heads in the cold winter's sun. The British cavalry had become separated in their overconfident pursuit of the isolated Americans. Colonel William Washington's dragoons stormed down into the British horsemen, cutting through them before they even realized the error they'd committed. On the main line, the British and Americans traded hellacious blows. The calamitous fighting stimulated Tarleton to send the 71st Highlanders and the reserve cavalry to the American right flank, thinking this would serve as the coup de grace. The Scottish Highlanders marched upon the right flank of the Continentals. As their bagpipes pierced through the roar of the rifle fire, the order was given to reposition the American flank and face the Highlanders head-on, but the command became interpreted as a call for retreat. Company by company, the entire Continental line followed suit as they observed their peers falling back. American officer John Howard acted swiftly and used the opportunity of the retreating young men to reposition the lines to better address the flanking assault by the Scots. The quick-thinking Howard had saved the battle from disaster. The sight of the American retreat had given one final shot of adrenaline to the exhausted British infantry, who had been ensconced in a firefight after marching 30 miles through the night. As they charged forward in disorganized negligence, the reformed American line held their fire until some of the charging British were just yards away, and then the order was given for the Continentals to unleash their muskets in unison. A chorus fire, smoke, and lead rang out. The British took the brunt of the discharge head-on. John Howard felt the seismic shift in the battle brought upon by this measured and furious volley, and consumed with the palpable essence of victory at hand, cried out to his men, "Charge! Bayonets!" The battle that once appeared to be a toss-up had suddenly turned into an all-out massacre. The Americans gave chase, butchering the stunned redcoats as they stumbled across the sloped terrain, others falling to their knees, begging for mercy and offering their surrender. Tarleton had witnessed this astounding devolution and rode to his last remaining intact unit, the British Legion Cavalry, and ordered them to charge into the pursuing Americans, but they disregarded his command and fled from the battlefield. Colonel Washington's cavalry had fallen upon the British dragoons, and then the American commander-in-chief's young cousin found Tarleton and called out to him, "Where is now the boasting Tarleton?" A British cavalryman rode up to attack Washington, but was shot down by an American trumpeter. Washington managed to slash Tarleton's right hand with his saber, and Tarleton shot back towards Washington as he fled, grazing the American colonel's knee and wounding his horse. Washington gave Tarleton a tenacious pursuit, following him for 16 miles. Yet Tarleton managed to escape into a plantation. In the battle's immediate aftermath, Morgan had taken 712 British prisoners and had killed over 100 redcoats, wounding an additional 200 more. Continental and militia forces suffered 25 killed and over 100 wounded. Daniel Morgan may not have his face carved into Mount Rushmore or adorned on a dollar bill. He was, aside from a single term in the House of Representatives, apolitical for most of his life. Yet Daniel Morgan was the perfect embodiment of the fiercely individual, doggedly determined, red-blooded colonial American that through unwavering persistence wrested free his own nation from the empire on which the sun never set. The American victory on that cold January morning, deep in the heart of the Carolinas, would set the stage for the final year of battle in the American Revolution. Their stunning defeat at the Battle of Cowpens had left Cornwallis and the British reeling, but it would take the Americans calling upon one of the United Kingdom's oldest foes to finally purge King George's men from their young nation. However, these final campaigns for American independence in 1781 are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Coahuila, Mexico, December 1840. In the shallow, chilly water of the Rio Grande, a large group of Comanche warriors guide their horses from the northern banks in Texas to the southern banks in Mexico, intent on wreaking havoc upon the small settlements that dot northern Mexico. Though the name Comanche is enough to strike terror in the hearts of nearly every settler in the newly won state of Texas, their reputation extends far beyond the international border delineated by the Rio Grande. For centuries now, far longer than their Texan counterparts, the Spanish and then Mexican citizens who made their way north into the Chihuahuan Desert and then past the Rio Grande and onto the stepped plains of the Llano Estacado had been subject to the horrific reality of Comanche raiding. Stories of Comanche brutality had been passed on like family heirlooms from survivors, with accounts of ferocious murders and merciless assaults, with countless women and children taken prisoner, most never to be seen again. Although a workable peace deal had been agreed to and abided by between the Mexican settlers and the Comanche in the late 1700s, it had slowly but surely dissolved, and by the 1830s, settlements all around northern Mexico, including what is now the state of Texas, were once again subject to incessant raiding from not only the Comanche, but their longtime allies in the Kiowa, as well as other tribes such as the Navajo and the Apache. But it is the Comanche whose name conjures up the most visceral images of terror and trepidation in the minds of the Mexican citizens inhabiting the very southernmost reaches of Comanche territory. Now, awash in the stinging chill of the biting north wind, the small settlements and long-established cities that line the Rio Sabinas, a tributary of the Rio Grande, fall victim to this Comanche raiding party, who systematically sweeps through town after town, mowing their way southward with ruthless abandon. San Juan de Sabinas, Soledad, Peroteran, Abayos, and countless other small settlements all cut a strikingly similar scene in the wake of Comanche attack. Their rooftops lit on fire, the ground littered with carcasses of livestock and bodies of men, women, and children, and a bone-chilling silence in the absence of the prisoners that had been taken. In the state capital of Saltillo, nearly 200 miles from the Mexico-Texas border, panic begins to sweep the streets as reports of Comanche atrocities flood in from ranches and haciendas nearer and nearer to the city. Only days before, the vast majority of the city of Saltillo's inhabitants would have considered the likelihood of the Comanche venturing so far south as to pose a threat to their city to be an absurd hypothetical situation. Now, with every day passing, the possibility seems more and more likely that the Comanche are on their way towards the sizable, centuries-old city. Still, the vast majority of the citizens who call Saltillo home are far more worried about the daily upkeep of their crops and livestock than with the seemingly remote possibility of the Comanche having the audacity to strike a city so far away from their homelands while being so wildly outnumbered. However, as the Comanche raiding party cuts their way through Zacatecas and then overruns the city of San Luis de Potosí, the grip of fear becomes stronger and stronger upon the residents of Saltillo. It has been over a century since San Luis de Potosí had seen the sight of attacking Comanches, but now it seems to many of the devoutly religious settlers and citizens that hell itself has been unleashed upon them. However, it is thought that the Comanche's next target will be the wealthy hacienda of San Francisco de los Patos, roughly 25 miles west of the city of Saltillo. With this presumption in mind, both professional soldiers and militiamen are marshaled from Saltillo and its surrounding towns in order to assist in defending the wealthier town from attack. A scant few defenders are left to oversee the security of the city of Saltillo, all under the command of Don Jose Maria Goribar. Goribar is a prominent citizen and longtime local resident who has served as a former governor of the state of Coahuila and now acts as the magistrate of the Superior Justice Tribunal. Due both to an enticing target in its wealthier neighbor and an imposing size and population, it is thought amongst Mexican military officials that Saltillo itself is still under little actual threat of assault from Comanche forces. After all, it is reasoned, an attack by the horsebound Comanche on such an entrenched position against such an overwhelmingly larger population of Mexican defenders is far less likely than those same Comanche plundering the far wealthier San Francisco de Plato. Though this is a perfectly rational assumption, Don Jose Maria Goribar and his small group of resolute but decidedly semi-professional defenders are horrified to see the Comanche raiding party charging towards their city. With little time to spare, the small force takes to their horses and rides out of the city in order to meet the oncoming Comanche. Most among them find themselves nearly nauseated at the prospect of their near certain death, until a seemingly miraculous turn in the action takes place. Before the two parties reach within rifle range of each other, the Comanche stop their ponies in their tracks, turn, and begin to retreat back down the very same path from which they have come. Seeing this fortuitous break, the advancing Mexican force becomes more self-assured in their capabilities. Under the command of Don Jose Maria Goribar, the men dismount and set up a firing line on which to block the road into Saltillo. However, in the brief interim between dismounting and assembling themselves into a defensive formation, the Mexican settlers and militiamen are met with what must be a blood-curdling sight. The Comanche, once retreating only moments before, have now reversed course and are barreling down upon their dismounted foe with the intent of killing them all to a man. The Mexican forces now scramble for their horses, sprinting towards their mounts in a tragically futile attempt to outrun the oncoming Comanche ponies. In mere moments before they can reach their horses and make their escape, Don Jose Maria Goribar and every one of his men are cut down by Comanche arrows and lances, then summarily stripped of their valuables, mutilated, and left to rot on the side of the road in Saltillo. The city of Saltillo itself now sits undefended, and a veil of terror and violence descend upon the city as the Comanches sweep through it, killing and plundering without discrimination. The Comanche, already laden down with the spoils of their previous raiding, now seem more bent on killing rather than accumulating more livestock, material goods, and prisoners. While nearly 2,000 horses are taken, nearly 1,100 cows, goats, sheep, and pigs are slaughtered and left to rot where they fall. The streets of Saltillo are soon awash in blood as the Comanche make their way from home to home, carrying off any women or children deemed to be good prisoners and killing the rest, until they finally grow bored and continue on their egress northwards to the border, now laden down with even more goods and prisoners. In total, 26 women and children are taken from Saltillo, destined for hard lives as captives and slaves. Behind them are left the bodies of over 100 of their fellow countrymen, many of them cut down inside of their homes. For their part, the Comanche raiders are now so encumbered by their loot that their movement northward is a rather tedious march, herding what is now a sizable group of thousands of horses. They are also so secure in their martial prowess and so intent on enjoying the spoils of their conquest that the party is slow to leave the city limits upon deciding to finally conclude their raiding. Meanwhile, reinforcements from the city of Para de la Fuente are rushing towards Saltillo, with the hopes of at least defending the survivors and driving off the Comanche. Upon their arrival, these reinforcements join forces with another small impromptu militia force that has been raised from the survivors of Saltillo. Before the Comanche are able to fully exit the city, they find themselves on the brunt end of an attack from the newly assembled soldiers and militiamen, intent on recapturing their loved ones and livestock and killing as many of the Comanche as possible. Caught off guard and now far less mobile, the Comanche flee the vicinity, but only after losing 9 of their own warriors and 3,000 head of horses and mules, as well as 11 of their newly gotten captives. The Mexican forces from Saltillo now pursue the Comanche for weeks as they lumbered northwards towards the Rio Grande. Finally, as the Comanche are readying their sizable contingent to cross the river, they are set upon by the men from Saltillo and again brutally caught off guard. The vast majority of the Comanche's livestock and prisoners are recaptured, and many more Comanche warriors killed before they are finally able to make their escape across the Rio Grande. Though the raid upon Saltillo would certainly prove to be a seminal, traumatizing event in the lives of those who had survived it, it is by no means unique, nor inexplicable. As author Brian DeLay notes in his work War of a Thousand Deserts, Indian Raids in the U.S.-Mexican War, it was the Comanche who in fact held political, military, and economic dominance over the area encompassing modern-day Kansas to northern Mexico. Their Spartan-esque society left little opportunity for young men to advance themselves socially, economically, or politically outside of raiding, hunting, and warfare. Thus, the raids like those wrought upon the people of Saltillo and its surrounding areas served as multi-purpose endeavors to simultaneously build the fortunes and further the reputations of young Comanche men with little to no opportunity to do so elsewhere, as well as to instill a highly useful sense of terror and dread in the peoples who inhabited the lands the Comanche considered to be their own. Whether these peoples were Texans, Mexicans, or rival tribes made little difference to the Comanche themselves. However, the constant pressure exerted upon both Texas and Mexico not only inexorably shaped the domestic policies of both, it was also cause for considerable discontent and disagreement between the two nations in regards to addressing the problem of Comanche raiding. In the ongoing land war for Texas that encompassed the 1820s and 30s, the Comanche held more sway than any of their rivals, a nearly unthinkable feat for a tribe who only a few centuries before had been relegated to the bottom rung of the tribal hierarchy in their original homelands of the northern Rockies. However, the coming decades would see the Comanche upended by wave after wave of infectious diseases in the form of cholera and smallpox, maladies their native immune systems were often ill-prepared to deal with. By some estimations, nearly half of some tribal bands would perish in a near-apocalyptic scene which saw many sick and dying Comanches left behind by their families who could find no other solution but to leave their loved ones and flee for their own lives from this unseeable evil. By the 1880s, the Comanche would find themselves relegated to the reservation system in Oklahoma. Once the proud and fearsome lord of the southern plains, they would spend the remainder of the century, and much of the next, attempting to rebuild from the devastating effects of endless warfare and disease. Saltillo would go on to rebuild after the Comanche attack, only to find itself caught in the midst of the Mexican-American War 6 years later. Though their stories are often overlooked in the greater scope of the history of the Old West, the citizens of Mexico who settled the areas just south of today's U.S.-Mexico border suffered under some of the most consistent and violent raiding ever wrought by the Comanche upon their enemies. However, the countless tales of entire towns burned to the ground, entire fortunes being lost, and entire families being either killed or taken prisoner are too numerous to mention here in one episode with due diligence and respect. For tonight, those are other stories for other times. Japan, April 13th, 1612. On a tiny island known as Ganryoshima, located between the larger islands of Honshu and Kyushu, a well-known samurai named Sasaki Kojiro stalks the shoreline, growing ever more incensed by the minute. He has an appointment, as it were, to fight another samurai in a one-on-one sword duel. The fight is an intensely serious matter, one that can, and often does, lead to grievous injury and death. Kojiro is an experienced samurai, the elite warrior class that, even at this point in the 1600s, has existed in Japan for centuries. He is a veteran of many such duels, and a highly acclaimed fighter, known for his unique fighting style, one that is based upon his unique choice of weaponry. Kojiro employs a katana, the legendary long blade of the samurai, that is substantially longer and heavier than the standard sword. This has enabled him to strike with great power from greater range than all of his opponents thus far. He goes by the fighting name Ganryu, meaning large rock style. It is rumored that Kojiro was a student of the legendary swordsman Toda Saigen, who excelled in the use of the short blade known as the kodachi. The local story holds that after months of sparring with a local short blade master Saigen, Kojiro adopted the long blade katana, a more cumbersome but powerful weapon which better suited the young samurai's physicality. Another account holds that it was actually Kanamaki Jisai, himself a former student of Toda Saigen, who was Kojiro's teacher. Regardless of the origin of his fighting style, the results of Kojiro's natural proclivity and his efforts in training have become the stuff of local legend in recent years. In duel after duel, many of them being to the death, Kojiro has proven his skills and fortitude. He is not only a formidable fighter, he is one of the best, perhaps the best, swordsmen in all of Japan. Since the beginning, in accordance with the samurai tradition of discipline that will eventually become known as the Code of Bushido, Kojiro has made it a point to show up on time and prepared, be it for a training session or an actual duel. Today has been no different, as Kojiro has risen at dawn, said his prayers, donned his armor, and arrived at the appointed place of combat well ahead of time, with a slew of onlookers and assistants in tow. But his opponent on this day has not seen fit to extend such basic courtesy to all involved. This is a major breach of etiquette, and Kojiro is understandably growing increasingly indignant. Finally, a rowboat appears in the distance, placidly making its way towards the island. Though its arrival is by now hours late, the vessel seems to travel at the speed of someone on a sightseeing tour. Finally, the boat rides the gentle waves into the rocky shore, and outsteps an austerely dressed, unkempt, and apparently unhurried man. His demeanor is workmanlike, seemingly almost bored, as though he has been in this exact same place 100 times before, in an austere location only minutes away from facing a highly skilled opponent in a fight that could be to the death. This is because he has. The man's name is Miyamoto Musashi, considered by many, if not most, to be the actual greatest swordsman in Japan. Considering the gravity of the situation at hand, his seeming lack of concern is palpably disconcerting. As he strides sure-footedly away from the rowboat, Miyamoto Musashi seems wholly unbothered by his obviously aggravated opponent. While Sasaki Kojiro cuts the expectedly imposing figure of a samurai, ornately adorned in polished armor, gleaming steel blade in hand, emanating an air of controlled fury, held in check only by his years of tireless training, Miyamoto Musashi is clothed in simple garments, with uncombed hair and eczema-scarred skin. However, despite his slightly puzzling appearance, he seems to possess the cold, hard demeanor of a hitman. Perhaps the most striking feature of the enigmatic warrior making his way towards his opponent now is what he lacks: a sword of his own. Instead, he carries a boat oar that he has spent the preceding few hours carving into a crude, makeshift wooden katana. In this world of ritual and respect, Musashi has introduced an element of unadulterated chaos. But in such chaos lies Musashi's strategic, calculated genius. A genius he has fostered over the preceding decades, in a life that will ultimately become the stuff of Japanese legend. Miyamoto Musashi was born Shinmin Musashi no Kami Fujiwara no Haranobu in either the Harima province or the Mimisaka province in the year 1584. His father, Shinmin Munisai, was himself a legendary swordsman and martial artist. Musashi was trained from an early age in both the ways of armed and unarmed combat, but it was at the age of only 7 that his father cast him into the streets after an argument, not allowing him to return. With Musashi's mother having passed away only a few years earlier, he was now relegated to fending for himself. Luckily for the beleaguered youngster, a kindly uncle named Dorin-bo took him in, and he was raised in a temple near Harajuku. Here, Dorin-bo and another uncle named Tasumi educated the young Musashi in the ways of Buddhism, as well as reading, writing, and arithmetic. He also continued to train in the martial arts and swordsmanship, and, according to his own account in his legendary autobiography and treatise on combat, known as Go-Rin no Sho, or the Book of 5 Rings, he fought his first duel at the age of only 13. Musashi's personal account of the events is as follows. I have trained in the way of strategy since my youth. At the age of 13, I fought a duel for the first time. My opponent was called Arima Kihai, a sword adept of the Shinto Ryo, and I defeated him. At the age of 16, I defeated a powerful adept by the name of Akiyama, who came from the prefecture of Tajima. At the age of 21, I went up to Kyoto and fought duels with several adepts of the sword from famous schools, but I never lost. In the interim, at roughly the age of 20, Musashi also found himself caught up in one of the deadliest large-scale battles in Japanese history. In the year 1600, war had ignited between the Toyotomi and Tokugawa clans. Musashi had fought on the side of the Toyotomi in what was known as the Army of the West. He is reported to have participated in the defense of Jifu Castle, the assault on Fushimi Castle, and the devastating defeat suffered at the Battle of Sekigahara. During the Battle of Sekigahara, Toyotomi's Army of the West was decisively routed, and its forces dispersed as the men fled into the surrounding villages and countryside. According to legend, Musashi had sought refuge in the wilderness surrounding Mount Heiko, or Heiko-san. Here, he trained relentlessly, refining the martial skills he had learned as a child. Over the coming years, he would build his reputation as a formidable fighter as he traveled Japan to compete against other samurais in duels. Though not all duels were to the death, unless this stipulation had been previously agreed to by both combatants, injury was not uncommon, and the damage done to one's reputation was often seen by many as worse than death. As the years passed, Musashi built a progressively more formidable reputation as not only a skilled fighter, but an innovator and a refiner of techniques, as well as a deeply contemplative warrior. He would continue to live a vagabond-like existence until 1611, where he had begun to frequent the Myohinji Daishan Inn, where he had met a man who served as a vassal to Lord Hokusawa Tadaoki, a powerful local lord who had been given charge of northern Kyushu. The man was named Nagaoka Sado. The two men developed a friendship at the temple, as Sado was well aware of Musashi's reputation and was likely an admirer of his skills as well. Some sources cite Sado as the critical proponent of the duel between Musashi and Sojiro, arguing repeatedly that the time had come to determine who was in fact the greatest swordsman in Japan. After the customary challenge and negotiation, the date of April 13th, 1612, had been agreed to. Now, the day of the fight has arrived, and though the gathering of spectators has been expressly forbidden by civic officials, this has done little in the way of actually prohibiting onlookers from crowding onto the shoreline in hopes of catching even a glimpse of what will likely go down as the greatest samurai duel in history. Musashi, despite his unkempt appearance and detached, unbothered demeanor here on the rocky shoreline facing down his opponent, has anticipated that Kojiro will in fact be his toughest opponent to date. He knows that he will need every strategic and tactical advantage that he can bring to bear. Thus, every action he has taken today, and every facet of his appearance, has been part of a cold, calculated plan meant to disrupt his opponent's mindset. Musashi has risen late, slowly eaten his breakfast, and made his way to the appointed place of combat under condition of deliberate tardiness. He has shown up not only late, and not only looking as though he has just rolled out of bed, and virtually unarmed save for the boat oar that he carries. Though all of these affronts to the samurai code would seem to the casual observer to have set Musashi up poorly for potential success, in this rare instance, the inverse is proving true. Kojiro, one of Japanese most experienced and adept swordsmen, has come prepared for the high-stakes matchup under the auspices of normality, expecting tradition and ceremony to be afforded their customary precedence. But in introducing these purposeful slights of honor not only to his opponent, but to the spectators and to the event itself, Musashi has masterfully utilized chaos as a means to mentally unbalance his opponent. Kojiro is himself a master of the traditional form of samurai dueling, but Musashi, via a combination of foresight, experience, and natural-born disposition, has refused to cede even the most minute of strategic ground, preferring to defy social norms in the interest of personal victory. In Japanese martial tradition, this is a nearly unheard-of instance. However, in keeping with the very core of samurai tradition, Musashi has taken great care in envisioning and enacting his detailed plan. Every aspect of the chaos being introduced by Musashi is purposely designed to impart a very specific psychological impact. Every skill that he will use to bring his vision to fruition has been carefully honed through years of rigorous training. Kojiro, not impressed by these factors, begins to berate his opponent for being late, chiding him and implying that he has done so out of cowardice. Still in a fit of rage, Kojiro throws the scabbard of his sword into the water, indicating that he intends to fight to the death. Musashi, well aware of the meaning of the gesture, and in fact quite pleased that the strategy is working, assures Kojiro that this is just as well, as he will never have an opportunity to use his scabbard in this world again. Though these fights are generally officiated by a referee, the two warriors now circle each other, paying no attention to the appointed official, intent only on their opponent's destruction. As they move, both bring their weapons forward, with Kojiro taking a unique stance in which his hands are held high, baiting Musashi in for a strike, which he plans to counter by capitalizing on his weapon's superior range. But the weapon Musashi wields is also part of his larger plan. He has carved the boat oar a mere few inches longer than Kojiro's sword, effectively nullifying one of Kojiro's greatest advantages. However, this scarcely perceptible tactic is lost amid the torrent of confusion and effrontery that Musashi has unleashed. In the midst of this, though, Musashi's demeanor remains that of a laborer on a worksite, not in the least caught up in the ire of his opponent, not to mention the crowd and officials whom he has also kept waiting. Musashi's eyes fade into a shark-like, emotionless focus. Holding the boat oar out as a gauge for distance, Musashi makes no move to give Kojiro an attack to counter. Taking this as a further display of cowardice, Kojiro has now worked himself into a blinding fury. In Kojiro's mind, Musashi has not only deeply disrespected him, but he has wholly disregarded the samurai tradition of honor and respect between dueling opponents. Kojiro now decides that Musashi must not be allowed to besmirch the code that so many have lived by and died for. Now, he decides, is the time to cut this vagabond down once and for all for his insolence. Kojiro moves in a flash, charging forward in short, decisive steps as he whips his blade in a circular pattern known as the swallow's cut. Musashi, however, has rendered his next movements relatively unpredictable, as he has not taken up a traditional stance and is weighed down with a heavier than normal weapon. In a rare instance, Kojiro's cut misses, as Musashi sidesteps the elongated blade, by some accounts doing so by such a close margin that his headband is cut and falls to the ground. Now, in a decisive blow akin to the local butcher dispatching an autumn hog, Musashi crashes down upon the skull of Kojiro with the boat oar, striking him with several blows so powerful that the mere audible memory alone will haunt many onlookers present for days to come. Within seconds, the fight is over. Sasaki Kojiro, one of Japan's greatest samurai, now lies dead on a remote beach as a group of horrified onlookers and officials gaze at his gore-covered opponent in equal parts shock and awe. Miyamoto Musashi now stands boat oar in hand over his fallen opponent. In later accounts, Musashi will write of Kojiro as his greatest challenge and toughest opponent, and it can only be imagined the wash of relief, rage, and reverence that befell the nervous system of Japan's greatest duelist. But now is no time for sentimentalities. Though his genius will go on to fill the pages of one of the most seminal works in practical approaches to combat in history, genius is often not recognized in its own time. Such is the case now, as several of the onlookers are unhappy, and while many of the crowd indeed admire the showcase of skill and psychological gamesmanship they have just witnessed, Musashi is well aware that he has created a contentious situation, and that now would be the most prudent time to make his exit. And so, with little fanfare, Musashi jumps back into his rowboat with his paid oarsmen already in place for their return journey. With no more fanfare nor ceremony than the aforementioned local butcher, Miyamoto Musashi sits emotionless as the boat makes its way back to the main island. This duel will go down as one of the most seminal events in Japanese samurai history, as well as one of the turning points in Musashi's life. Seeing the regrettable nature of losing one of Japan's greatest fighters simply to resolve an ego-driven quarrel, Musashi began more and more to contemplate the philosophical implications of fighting, and how he felt they should, or perhaps more aptly, that they must, be applied to combat. Certainly, though, this is but one duel of many in the legendary career of Miyamoto Musashi, who would go down in history as perhaps the greatest samurai swordsman of all time, as well as a nationally revered figure. In a fitting twist, one that would likely suit both men, Sasaki Kojiro has also become a revered figure in Japan, known as a courageous, skilled warrior who ardently upheld the code of Bushido. But the tales of the many battles of Miyamoto Musashi, as well as the countless other legendary samurai and samurai battles, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. July 27th, 1816. On the Apalachicola River, in the panhandle of Spanish Florida, stands Fort Negro, a former British-held enclave during the War of 1812, that is now inhabited by nearly 400 escaped slaves and their Choctaw allies. The ex-slaves, now known as Maroons, are making a desperate stand against an expeditionary force of several hundred American soldiers, Coweta and Creek warriors, and a devastating fleet of American gunboats. Under the command of Garçon, a 30-year-old carpenter who had fled from his life of forced servitude in Spanish-held Pensacola, the Maroons, and the Choctaw have made a death pact. They would accept nor offer any quarter. Knowing that surrender would at best be a means to return to bondage and their, quote, slave owners, they were determined to fight to the last man. After several days of intense combat, several instances of intense hand-to-hand fighting had taken place. Yet, more broadly, the battle was an encounter of artillery, with the gunners inside the fortification launching cannonballs, grape shot, and mortars towards the American forces. However, they did so with little efficacy. The U.S. gunboats achieved moderate success, but no clear advantage had been gained. This days-long stalemate had the American officers considering their options of either starving out the Maroons or ordering a far more costly assault on the fort with infantry and Coweta warriors. However, everything would change in an instant. As the U.S. gunboat 154 began heating their cannonballs in a makeshift furnace, one of the fiery hot projectiles was sent out in a volley that would end the battle at once. It cleared the high walls of the fort and landed directly in the armory. This set off a thunderous explosion that could be heard for over 100 miles. Dozens of bodies and limbs could be seen flying through the air. Men, women, and children alike, many of which had been set on fire. The American soldiers could scarcely celebrate the dramatic conclusion of the bloody affair as the humanity of the macabre scene overtook them. It has been known as the single deadliest shot in American history. More than 250 people died instantly. The U.S. executed Garçon, who had survived the blast, and then withdrew from Spanish Florida. News of the catastrophic battle quickly spread through American, Spanish, and native territories. Neamathla, the mighty Seminole leader, was furious at the destruction of the fort, and sent word to General Gaines that should his soldiers be found to have crossed the Flint River, they would face brutal attacks by the Seminole warriors. This would set in motion a series of violent escalations that came to be known as the First Seminole War, a conflict that would grip the Florida region for nearly 4 decades. Foultown was a village that had belonged to the Miccosukee Creek people, located in southwestern Georgia, just 15 miles east of Fort Scott. Chief Neamathla had already been angered by the U.S. reoccupation of Fort Scott in June of 1817. Captain Sanders Donahoe had arrived from Charleston in mid-June, and he would be reinforced by Major David E. Twiggs just a month later, arriving with his company of the 7th U.S. Infantry. The men had made an overland march from Fort Crawford in present-day East Bruton, Alabama. Their heavy supplies were shipped on the water by way of Mobile. The movement of the U.S. troops was observed with great interest by the collective chiefs that had inhabited the surrounding area. While many men were unhappy with the encroachment of the Americans, one in particular, William Perryman, of the Lower Creeks, welcomed their arrival. Perryman harbored resentment towards the Red Sticks over the fact that his brother had suffered when the fort had been burned by Tutolosis earlier that year. Perryman asked Twiggs to hold a council so that the chiefs could express their support for the United States. Major Twiggs would learn of Perryman's true motives just after the council had been held on August 4th and express his new understanding as such. Quote, "The objects of the chiefs and warriors who attended that meeting was to have a talk with the commanding officer, for the purpose of expressing their friendship to the United States and their intention of remaining at peace with the United States. I understand from another source, which at the time I deemed to be conclusive evidence of the fact, that one object of the chiefs and warriors who attended the meeting had in view was to flog in my presence the chief of Foultown, Neamathla, for his permitting his warriors to commit depredations on the inhabitants of the Georgia frontier, and afterwards stating those outrages committed by his own people to have been committed by the people of their own towns." Twiggs was surprised to be used as a vehicle for political posturing amongst tribal chiefs, but the move by Perryman was an astute, if not also dangerous one. as he so openly attempted to draw himself into the graces of the Americans. By so openly moving against Neamathla, he risked drawing himself into the Seminole leader's crosshairs. Twiggs would also discover that Perryman was not alone in his desire to admonish the Seminole, as Neamathla had also upset the first and second chiefs of Ekanachate, Ochisitalofa, and Chokonikla. The meeting was delayed until 4 in the afternoon, but Neamathla would not show up for the council, blunting Perryman's desire to publicly reprimand him. Major General Edmund Gaines was reassured by the attending chiefs of a desire to live in peace with the Americans, but the tribal leaders stated they did not believe the towns of natives to the east of Flint and Apalachicola rivers felt the same. This included Neamathla's Foul Town. Gaines demanded that Miccosukee surrender the warriors responsible for killing white settlers along the St. Mary's River. Major Twiggs responded to Gaines, tempering the expectations for cooperation, quote, "I have not heard a word from the Seminoles that can be relied upon, but in my opinion, they will never give up a murderer to the whites. In fact, the chief of Foul Town, who is frequently among the Seminoles, told me 8 days ago that the Flint River was the line between us, and I must not cut a single stick of timber on the opposite side." General Gaines had reached the same conclusion as Twiggs, that conflict with Neamathla was inevitable, but he would make one final demand for the surrender of the warriors responsible for the killings. Kapachimiko said he would respond within 10 days, and the message he would end up conveying addressed the changes that had occurred in the prior years, with their cattle being driven off by the whites, 3 natives having been killed, and the displacement to their side of the river. As it pertained to the Americans' desire to capture escaped slaves, he would state, "We have nothing to do with them. They were put here by the English, and to them you ought to apply to anything about them. We do not wish our country desolated by an army passing through it for the concern of other people. The Indians have slaves here also, a great many of them. When we have an opportunity, we shall apply to the English for them, but we cannot get them now." The chief was referring to the, quote, freedom papers given to any slave that was willing to take up arms on behalf of the British during the War of 1812. Major General Gaines would forward this response to Major General Andrew Jackson at the end of September 1817. Gaines would send a second letter to Jackson on October 1st, as well as one almost identical to it that he forwarded to the Secretary of War, explaining in detail that no other recourse besides the use of force remained. However, Gaines still requested that a survey of lands be conducted to distinguish borders of the territories that had been ceded to the Treaty of Fort Jackson that ended the Creek War in 1814. The Secretary of War authorized Gaines to remove natives from lands now claimed by the United States, so long as they did not cross into the Spanish-held territory. General Gaines and his columns of soldiers from the 4th and 7th Infantry crossed from Fort Crawford to Fort Gaines upon a military road cut by Major Twiggs. From there, they carried on to Fort Scott. They arrived at Fort Scott on November 18th. The first task upon arrival was to send a runner to Foul Town to request that Neamathla come to the post and meet with Gaines. But based upon the wording of the demand, Neamathla was left with only 2 real options: surrender or fight. Should he and his people attempt to flee, they would still be designated as enemies of the state. After Neamathla refused to surrender, Major Twiggs put together a battalion of 250 men and then set out for Foul Town on November 20th. Gaines told Twiggs not to fire upon women and children should the inevitable skirmishing occur. Twiggs and his men would cross the Flint River by boat and canoe, then turn back to the east to arrive at Foul Town just before dawn. Captain Hugh Young, an Army topographer, had written a description of Foul Town that curated accounts from several officers who had visited. Quote, "Foul Town, the last settlement of these Indians, was 12 miles east of Fort Scott, in a tolerable body of land. They had between 30 and 40 warriors, and their chief, Neamathla, was a man of talents and courage, although, in character, they were perfidious, cowardly, and mischievous." Neamathla had not been expecting any attack to come from the U.S. troops, and no warriors had been placed to defend the settlement from a surprise incursion. Thus, Twiggs had approached Foultown completely undetected. Once the presence of the Americans had been discovered, the natives fired upon their lines. The soldiers returned fire, launching a single, lethal volley into the village. 4 Seminole warriors and a Seminole woman were killed in the opening exchange. Observing that he had been taken by complete surprise and was outmanned and outgunned, Neamathla quickly ordered the evacuation of all his people from Foultown to a nearby swamp. Twiggs returned to Fort Scott with his battalion just after daybreak. The town was not razed, but rather left intact. A letter to Neamathla from the British was found in his home. The certificate read that he, quote, had always been a true and faithful friend of the British. General Gaines would send Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Arbuckle and a large contingent of men back to the town just 2 days later. The men of Arbuckle's 7th Infantry would approach the town from a different direction. This time, as the Americans made their approach, signal guns were fired into the sky as Seminole scouts had discovered the approaching men's flanking parties. Upon arriving at the town, they found it deserted, yet they could hear whoops and yells coming from the swampland that surrounded the settlement to the northeast. The Seminole corn reserves were being loaded into wagons by the troops when an assault was launched by the natives. The surprise attack was recounted by the Americans. Quote, the loading of the wagons was done when the Indians, 50 or 60 in number, were perceived advancing by the sentinels posted in the swamp and fired on. The fire was instantly returned by the Indians who, giving the war whoop, advanced rapidly towards our lines. Parties were immediately detached to take possession of the houses between our position and the swamp. A spirited fire was then kept up for 20 or 25 minutes when the Indians returned into the swamp. The native warriors could be seen traversing the open ground during the attack, and no less than 8 were observed killed, while several more were gravely wounded. Arbuckle was surprised by the intensity of the attack, in particular that the natives faced odds of no less than 6 to 1. But the American lieutenant colonel failed to understand how vital the corn reserves were to the people of Foultown in surviving the coming winter. The Americans retreated from the town, and Neamathla and his warriors fled deeper into the swamp. The U.S. troops marched north to Burgess Bluff and buried their lone casualty, a musician named Aaron Hughes. There, they began construction on a new fort. Arbuckle would name it Fort Hughes, after the fallen soldier. The U.S. Army raids directed at Foultown were objective failures. They did not succeed in removing the inhabitants from the lands ceded in the Treaty of Fort Jackson or in capturing Neamathla. What the expeditions did succeed in doing was unifying the Lower Creek, Seminoles, Black Seminoles, Red Sticks, and Miccosukee together in anger at this aggression from the Americans. The natives' reprisal to the U.S. Army's Foultown overture would be one of the most horrific massacres ever carried out upon American citizens in the barbarous history of the American and native affairs. But that grisly tale, and the many battles to come in the bloody and enduring Seminole Wars, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. London, England, 1887. William Jones sits backstage under a large tent, surrounded by Lakota warriors and American cowboys, with the pungent smell of gathered livestock permeating the air. Every few minutes, he glances at a cordoned-off section of seats, as does everyone else in the building. The seats are reserved for Queen Victoria. She, along with visiting dignitaries from throughout Europe, will be in the audience for this afternoon's performance of Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show. The show presents a recreated look at life in the Old West, with mock battles, dances, and demonstrations of marksmanship and horsemanship. However, as excited as this London audience is to see the legendary figures they have heard so much about from America, it is their countryman, William Jones, they are perhaps most excited to see. But William, a 48-year-old native of Castle Precincts, Bristol, is tired. His body aches from the rheumatism that plagues him. He has not slept well and dreads the task before him. This is all too understandable, as his job for the day will entail recounting, quite literally in front of Queen and country, the reasons why he had laid awake on so many nights for the better part of the last decade. Last night, His mind had, yet again, begun to race every time he finally began to drift off to sleep. Every few hours he had managed to finally fall into slumber, only to find himself back in the nightmare. The screams, the smoke, the gunfire, the pure, primal fear, it all came flooding back, jolting him awake and rendering him progressively more irritable and confused with every passing hour. Now, as Queen Victoria is shown to her seat, the torrent of emotions floods back into William's mind again. What is he doing here? How had he survived? And why had others not? How can he convey to these people, to the Queen for whom he had fought, the horrors that he and his comrades had been through that sweltering day in South Africa? The weight of his Victoria Cross feels odd to him, tugging down on the breast of his jacket. Though he is immensely proud of this great honor that he has earned, the price he has paid often leaves him wondering, what is it all worth? As the legendary frontiersman Buffalo Bill addresses the crowd, welcoming them to this most auspicious affair, Jones takes a deep breath and attempts to steady his nerves. But in a flash, his mind is there again. He is back at Rorke's Drift. It is January 1879. For years, the British have eyed the valuable territory of South Africa for both its natural resources and its geographic location. Diamonds had been discovered in 1867 near the Vaal River, sparking an even greater interest in the territory, especially amongst the local British officials. The ostensible plan, put forward by the notable and notorious Lord Carnarvon, is to institute a white ruling minority that will rule over a native black majority who will provide the workforce to operate British sugar plantations and diamond mining operations. Repeatedly, Lord Carnarvon and the local civilian authority, a man named Sir Henry Bartle Frere, have attempted to establish federations between themselves and the Dutch-descended Boer farmers who have inhabited the area since the 17th century, as well as the Swazi tribe who came to South Africa in the 15th century. However, the valuable territory, replete with natural resources and grandiose beauty, was already under the control of another powerful, militaristic empire, the Zulu. The Zulu had risen to prominence in the early 19th century, sweeping down from the west of Africa under the revolutionary leadership of Shaka Zulu, the legendary chieftain and warlord. Whereas intertribal conflicts on the African continent prior to Shaka's rise had consisted primarily of small raids and generally inconsequential skirmishes, Shaka had formed the Zulu into an enormous war machine that had taken over vast swaths of southern Africa. Under his leadership, the Zulu were molded into a warrior society whose structure and culture more closely resembled the Spartans of ancient Greece than it did any of their African contemporaries. By this time in 1879, the Zulu have seen the passing of their great king Shaka, and a subsequent decades-long power struggle for control of the tribe. Zulu society focuses almost exclusively on warfare, and a young man's advancement in their society is almost entirely dependent on his martial prowess. They operate under what is known as the Ukubutwa system, a term which means to be enrolled. This hierarchical system organizes young men and young women as well, though not as military combatants, according to their age sets. Men of similar age ranges live together in organized barracks, under the command of senior officers. They train in tactics, techniques, strategy, and fitness, all as a unit. The highly organized tactics of the Zulu require not only great numbers of soldiers to execute them, but repetitive and consistent drilling, focusing on even the most granular aspects of movement, communication, and combatives. Zulu weaponry consists of weapons that would, in many ways, seem familiar to a Roman legionnaire. Each Zulu warrior is equipped with a thick cowhide shield emblazoned with black and white designs. While accounts of Zulu shield-stopping bullets are, at best, highly exaggerated, they do provide a notable measure of defensive cover and an offensive option for bracing and pummeling an opponent. Behind their shield, a Zulu warrior carries at least one longer spear for throwing, as well as stabbing, known as an assegai. Oftentimes they carry knob-headed clubs, known as knob carries, made to crash down upon enemy skulls. They also carry another Shaka innovation, a shorter spear, made for close-range stabbing from behind their shields. It is known as an ikwa, named after the sound it makes when withdrawn from an enemy's body. But However revolutionary Shaka may have been in implementing new weaponry and organization, it is his strategic and tactical prowess that had managed to expand his empire at an unprecedented rate. Zulu war formations might, too, have been well familiar to a Roman legionary fighting in the wilds of Gaul nearly 2 millennia prior. Where their opponents' tactics were largely valiant, haphazard attacks, the Zulu are organized in stratified and well-drilled ranks, each positioned on the battlefield according to their age and experience. Each regiment of Zulu warriors is under the command of an officer in charge, distinguished by specific designs on his shield. Experienced and decorated soldiers might carry white shields, in effect distinguishing them as non-commissioned officers. Under Shaka's guidance, the Zulu have become masters of adapting a centuries-old hunting technique known as the horns of the buffalo, in which the main force of warriors holds the middle ground of a battlefield, then feigns retreat, allowing the enemy to advance as Zulu forces to the left and to the right quickly flank their positions and encircle them. Once caught in this trap, destruction is often all but certain. Using these tactics, the Zulu have wrought havoc on all who have opposed them throughout the majority of the 1800s. However, at times when this tactic is not practical, or even more desperate measures are called for, the Zulu are known to put forth unrelenting human waves of head-on charges designed to inflict maximum damage and buy time for retreating forces. By 1879, they are the dominant power throughout the entirety of southeastern Africa. And, in point of fact, as far as most in the British government are concerned, this is fine by them. By this time in the 19th century, Britain is finding itself increasingly overburdened by the enormity of its empire, and is loath to take on the responsibility of overtaking, colonizing, and then governing another remote locale on the planet that the vast majority of its citizens could not find on a map. The British are already ensnared in the Second Anglo-Afghan War, which will last until 1880. In the latter half of the 19th century alone, the British Army would fight in such faraway locales as Burma, Sudan, India, the Crimea, and Egypt, to name but a few. Suffice to say, the British government has little to no interest in expanding into yet another territory, as it would add more to their burden than it would to their wealth. However, this is not the opinion of Lord Carnarvon, nor Sir Bartle Frere, nor is it in keeping with the intentions of one Frederick Augustus Thesiger, 2nd Baron Chelmsford, otherwise known as Lord Chelmsford. Born in 1827 in London, England, the son of a wealthy lawyer and politician, Lord Chelmsford has served in the British Army since 1844, when he had purchased a commission in the Rifle Brigade after failing to obtain a position with the Grenadier Guards. He has served in the Crimean War of 1855, as well as the Indian Rebellion of 1857, steadily rising to the rank of Major General in 1877. Upon his arrival in South Africa, he initially leads campaigns against the Musashi tribe. These engagements amount to little more than skirmishes and result in the British routing their opponents in relatively short order. In Chelmsford's estimation, no native population armed with only spears and shields, no matter how numerous or well-trained, can compete against the mighty British Army. In Chelmsford's view, the time for cementing his own legacy and fortune, as well as the legacies and fortunes of his cohorts in Lord Carnarvon and Sir Henry Bartle Frere, is at hand. A month prior to this muggy, rain-soaked January, on December 11th of 1878, after spending months besieging the politicians in London with correspondence decrying the brutality of Zulu in the nearby territories, Sir Henry Bartle Frere had issued the Zulu king, King Cetshwayo, a list of ultimatums that the warrior monarch found both confusing and unreasonable. Until this time in the late 1870s, the British had largely gotten along peaceably with the Zulu. King Cetshwayo can see no need for such provocation, but upon reviewing the terms, which included the disbanding of the entire Zulu military, he has found them impossible to agree to. Bartle Frere has counted on this, and uses Cetshwayo's refusal to the terms as evidence to his superiors that a Zulu invasion of British territories is imminent, and the only way to stop it is to attack the Zulu first on their own land. Lord Chelmsford is appointed to command the operation, overseeing all British and Allied forces. These forces consist of 12 regular infantry companies with 6 companies from the 1st and 2nd Battalions and 6 from the 24th Foot Regiment. Including wagon drivers, servants, and civilian personnel, Chelmsford's forces amount to roughly 7,800 people. In comparison to the tens of thousands strong Zulu forces, this is a paltry number of combatants to bring into the field. But Chelmsford feels assured that it will be more than enough. Chelmsford divides his men into 3 columns, and on January 11, 1879, they slog their way across the Buffalo River at a place called Rorke's Drift, officially entering the heart of Zulu country. For his part, William Jones, serving with the 24th Foot Regiment, sees this excursion as yet another in a long line of relatively tedious assignments he has seen in his nearly 2 decades of service in the British Army. He has served in Mauritius, Burma, and India to name but a few of his appointments, but, aside from a smattering of good conduct medals, has accumulated no accolades nor time in combat. He had enlisted in Birmingham in 1858, married his wife Elizabeth on the 25th of May, 1875, and the couple had a son named William. Sadly, though, his wife had died the previous year, and Jones had sent his young son back to England to be cared for by his in-laws until his latest term of service with the Army was complete. Though he is certainly not under the impression that this is an entirely safe, carefree mission, Jones, along with most of the men in the 24th Foot Regiment, are expecting to see little in the way of resistance from the Zulu. Though strained under the aforementioned burdens of supporting a worldwide empire, the British Army is, for all intents and purposes, the dominant military power in the world at this point in time. They are not only largely experienced and universally well-trained, but equipped with some of the most advanced weaponry on the planet at the time in the way of their service rifles and artillery. Each British soldier, clad in their trademark red coats and white helmets, carries the 5.77/450 caliber Martini Henry rifle, with an effective firing range of 400 yards and a rate of fire of up to 12 rounds a minute. The breech-loading single-shot lever-action rifle possessed a mighty recoil and devastating firepower. Each soldier is also equipped with the pattern 1876 Martini Henry socket bayonet, which, when affixed to the end of the Martini Henry rifle, renders their firearms a comparable stabbing threat to that of the Zulu Ikwa. Before crossing the Buffalo River, Major General Chelmsford had split the force into 3 columns. The 2 main columns consist of British troops, with Column 1 being the less experienced troops and Column 3 being the more seasoned soldiers. The smaller column number 2 consists of native African troops and cavalry. Though he is a veteran soldier, William Jones finds himself assigned to the first column with troops who are mostly in their 20s. This column is left at Rorke's Drift, a local trading post and Lutheran mission, under the command of Lieutenant John Chard of the Royal Engineers and Lieutenant Gonville Brumhead of the 24th Foot Regiment, 2 much beloved but underwhelming officers. The rest of the British forces, under the command of Chelmsford, proceed roughly 10 miles inland and make camp at the base of a large, isolated hill known as Isandlwana. Here, 1,800 troops from the 2nd and 3rd columns make camp in the shadow of the imposing monolith. This will be their base in the coming days, as patrols are sent out in order to find and engage Zulu forces. Early on the morning of January 22nd, as the dawn breaks clear and the temperatures begin to climb rapidly, Chelmsford assembles a contingent of troops and heads out in search of the Zulu, and the personal glory that is sure to be had. Within a few hours of Chelmsford's departure, a scouting detachment from Isandlwana crests a nearby ridge, only to stumble upon the entirety of the mighty Zulu army. Upon receiving the news that the British have crossed the Buffalo River, this Zulu force, estimated to be roughly 20,000 strong, has run more than 70 miles over harsh African terrain and scorching temperatures just to get here, within striking distance of the British camp. However, as it is the beginning of a new lunar cycle, the Zulu commander, Nchingwe Koza, has decided to give his men a day of rest, as it is generally considered poor practice to attack on days of what the Zulu refer to as a dead moon. But once the Zulu realize they have been spotted, their forces are roused for an immediate attack. Over the succeeding few hours, 10 to 15,000 Zulu warriors swarm down upon the British at Isandlwana in a relentless series of head-on attacks. By club and spear, they kill every single infantry soldier present. In the middle of the attack, a solar eclipse takes place, casting an eerie pall over an already hellish scene. In vicious close-quarter combat, the Zulu and British stab, shoot, slash, and strike one another in a flurry of violence, rage, and terror until finally, there are no British left alive. 1,800 veteran soldiers who had awoken that day to yet another yeoman's breakfast of tea and biscuits, expecting to carry out a day of banal drudgery, now lie strewn across the African plains, eviscerated by their Zulu vanquishers who believe that a slain man's soul will stay trapped in his body if not released through his stomach. The Zulu have also taken heavy losses, with between 1,000 to 3,000 of their warriors killed and 2,000 wounded. In a force of 20,000, these losses will prove hugely consequential moving forward. However, there are still many Zulu warriors present, estimates range from 3,000 to 5,000, who have not gotten to participate at all in the battle, as it happened so quickly and with such ferocity. These men, still spoiling for a fight, now turn their attention towards the smaller British encampment at Rorke's Drift. As their comrades pillage the British and honor their dead, this contingent of Zulu embark on yet another exhausting run, this time heading for Rorke's Drift. A scant few cavalrymen have escaped across the Buffalo River and are headed to Rorke's Drift atop their exhausted mounts, having narrowly missed the horrific fates of their comrades. As the Zulu warriors and British survivors make a mad dash towards Rorke's Drift, all in the camp at Rorke's Drift are blissfully unaware that anything out of the ordinary, save for the solar eclipse earlier that day, has taken place. At 104 degrees Fahrenheit, the day is swelteringly hot, even for this time of year. At just after 3 in the afternoon, a group of British troops, as well as a Swedish missionary named Otto Witt, are atop the large hill that overlooks Rorke's Drift, known as Oscarberg Hill. They are attempting to get a look at the campsite at Isandlwana, but are unable to see anything of note from such a distance. Suddenly, they spot a small group of riders coming around the hill towards the campsite at Rorke's Drift. The riders race into camp and inform a shocked Lieutenant Brumhead of what has just occurred at Isandlwana. At a guard shack a little over a mile away, Lieutenant Chard has spotted 2 more riders who inform him of what has happened, and that the Zulus are on their way. Brumhead, Chard, and the other officers hurriedly convene inside the mission building, where a brief but vociferous debate is had on whether or not they should attempt to flee or stay and fight. At the zenith of the argument, Assistant Commissary James Langley Dalton, a 46-year-old former sergeant in the 85th Foot Regiment, advises that the British do all they can to fortify the mission building and hospital against attack, and that they then stay and fight. He reasons that attempting to combat the Zulu from behind even the most meager of defenses gives them a better chance of survival than being caught by the Zulu on the open plains or in attempting to cross the Buffalo River. His rationale is agreed to, and the troops are informed of the situation and immediately ordered to begin building barriers with whatever they can find. With little time to let the situation sink in, William Jones and the remainder of the 140 British troops present, along with 11 colonial troops, begin building walls connecting the buildings in order to create an ad hoc fort. 50-pound boxes of biscuits and 100-pound boxes of cornmeal, staple rations for the British Army, are stacked up upon each other, with the urgency and anxiety of the men building just as rapidly as their fortification. Soon, the mission building and hospital have been connected by one wall on the south side with another wall building a longer perimeter along the north side, with another wall cutting the courtyard in the middle in 2. This would serve as a fallback position should the Zulu overwhelm the first wall. Otto Witt, the Swedish missionary, now takes his lead, making a dash back to tend to his family at another trading post 30 miles away. Just after 4 p.m., a Lieutenant Henderson and 100 cavalrymen arrive from Isandlwana. They are asked by Lieutenant Chard to ride out towards the oncoming Zulu and do all that they can to slow them down. Lieutenant Henderson and his men, thoroughly traumatized from the events only hours before at Isandlwana, do their best to oblige. They ride out, but are soon seen hurrying back towards the fort. They have spotted the Zulu warriors, thousands strong, swarming now towards the small haphazard fortifications of Rorke's Drift, and they have decided that they can take no more. With their nerves sufficiently frazzled, the cavalrymen make a mad dash past the men now ensconced behind the walls at Rorke's Drift, hoping to save their own lives. Though no recourse is taken on the cavalrymen, a group of native Natal South African soldiers also begins to flee, Caught up in the confusion, a young corporal named William Anderson, 2nd Battalion, 3rd Regiment of the Native Natal contingent, begins to run. Suddenly, the retort of a Martini Henry rings out, and gun smoke fills the thick, heavy air. At the same instant, the young corporal falls dead, only a few dozen yards away from the walls. In later examination, it is unclear whether Corporal Anderson was indeed abandoning his post or simply confused by the retreat of those around him. Either way, his death will be the first that the British forces at Rorke's Drift will suffer that day. It will certainly, however, not be the last. Minutes after Corporal Anderson breathes his last, a chilling sound can be heard. The haunting, rhythmic, bellicose chants of the Zulu draw nearer and nearer. The 3,000 to 5,000 glory-hungry, indignant, highly trained and experienced Zulu warriors from Isandlwana have arrived, and they have come with the sole intention of wiping out every single British soldier and citizen there, securing themselves the glory they had earlier been denied. At first, the Zulu pepper the British compound with gunfire from Oscarburg Hill. The Zulu are thought to have either acquired muskets from traders or taken the British's own Martini Henrys from the vanquished soldiers at Isandlwana. Though exactly how the Zulu acquired the firearms and which firearms they are will become a matter of some contention, the results for the men now fighting for their lives at Rorke's Drift are the same, as several fall from gunshot wounds. As soon as the fire from the hilltop begins to wither around 4:30 p.m., the first Zulu attack sweeps around the south of the compound and makes a direct assault on the low wall in front of the hospital. Inside of the hospital are several men too sick to be moved, as well as the soldiers assigned to protect the building with gunfire through freshly cut gun holes in the mud brick walls. Among these soldiers is Private William Jones. He, as well as Corporal William Wilson Allen, Privates Cole, Dunbar, Hitch, Horrigan, John Williams, Joseph Williams, Alfred Hook, and Robert Jones have been assigned to defend the hospital and the men within it. The hospital building, however, presents a daunting prospect to defend, as 3 of its rooms are disconnected from the main room of the building. These rooms have only one door leading in and out of the room itself. Inside of these rooms, now struggling to steady his nerves along with the rest of his comrades, is William Jones. He and the rest of the men inside know that, should the Zulu break through the barricade and assault the hospital building directly, they will be trapped. But there is no time left to address this now, as the Zulu attack is on. The British received the first attack by firing upon the charging warriors first at about 600 yards, mostly to little effect. However, the successive volleys, as the Zulu advance nearer and nearer, chanting loudly and swinging their shields rhythmically, are more effective. Many Zulu fall, but the charge carries on until they are within 50 yards of the low barricade. Then the Zulu fall back, to reorganize for another attack. Within minutes, that attack comes, and then another. Again and again, the Zulu assault the low wall on the north side, with several attacks reaching the wall and resulting in brutal hand-to-hand combat, as the defenders desperately fought to hold their ground from behind their makeshift barriers. Finally, at around 6 p.m., Lieutenant Chard pulls his men off the north wall, as the losses being inflicted are too heavy to continue its defense. This saves the majority of his troops, but leaves the men in the isolated rooms trapped, as their only route of escape is now blocked by thousands of Zulu warriors bearing down upon them. The attacks continue on relentlessly, with the greatest ferocity focused on the trapped and vulnerable men in the isolated rooms. Soon, it is clear to the men inside the closet-sized room next to the veranda that the building will be overtaken by the Zulu. As Privates Horrigan and Joseph Williams pull their revolvers and cut down the Zulu breaching the doorway, John Williams digs at the wall separating their room from the next room. Eventually, he makes it through to the next room, and the men are able to escape the room nearest to the veranda, dragging the patients through the hole with them. In the next room, and the next, the process is repeated for the better part of an hour. As John Williams frantically digs, the fight rages on, with the soldiers in each room firing through the doors and windows in the desperate attempts to keep the Zulu at bay. One of the patients is eventually seized by the Zulu, dragged out of the door, and stabbed to death in front of the hospital. Another has to be left as he is too delirious with fever to be moved through the holes being dug in the walls. Private Waters, a defender in the second room, panics as the rest of the British squeeze through into the third room just before the Zulus swarm in. Waters does, however, manage to jump into a wardrobe in the room, and, in their haste to continue their assault into the next room, the Zulu do not find him. William Jones has been desperately defending his assigned position in the room closest to the courtyard and is unaware that the other soldiers have been methodically tunneling their way towards him for nearly an hour. He is at first greatly panicked by the unexpected breaching of the wall, and then quickly relieved at the sight of friendly faces making their way, one by one, through the hole. But momentary relief brought on by the sight of his comrades is quickly replaced by the sickening smell of smoke. The Zulu have set fire to the building. The only means of escape now is for the defenders and patients, many of whom are gravely ill or wounded by this point, to make a 6-foot drop out of the window of the third room into the courtyard between the hospital and the mission building where the rest of the British force is ensconced. Seeing that this is the only possible course of action, 2 soldiers at the mission, Lance Corporal William Allen and Private Fred Hitch, make a mad dash across the open, exposed courtyard and assist in lowering the patients, and then the soldiers, through the window and onto the ground. William Jones is one of the last defenders in the hospital, resolutely firing upon the Zulu attackers until the barrel of his rifle is so hot he has to wrap it in his red tunic in order to continue shooting. As smoke fills the room and the Zulu begin to breach the door, Williams finally drops through the window and into the courtyard, where he, Lance Corporal Allen, and Private Hitch make their way across the deadly 50 yards separating the buildings, now fully illuminated by the light of the burning hospital. Of the 11 patients in the hospital, they have managed to save 9. All of the able-bodied defenders of the hospital, even Private Waters, who has hidden himself away in the wardrobe of the second room, are still alive. But their fight is not over. For the remainder of the night, attack after attack pours down upon the troops at the compound. The men fight on desperately, with each soldier firing at least 100 rounds, their shoulders and ears suffering from the rifle's mighty roar and recoil. However, their accuracy is now aided by the light of the flames coming from the hospital roof. The Zulu make desperate, courageous charge after charge, but more and more are cut down by British rifle fire as the night wears on. Finally, just as dawn breaks, the Zulu attacks begin to slow, then cease altogether. The Zulu commander present, Prince Dabulamanzi Kampande, has breached the orders of his brother, the Zulu King Katsueo, who has approved the attack of the Sandalwana, but not this additional attack on Rorke's Drift. As his losses continue to mount, the rogue Zulu commander begins to fear more and more that he will incur the wrath of his king. Finally, at around 8 a.m., the Zulu are seen again, this time roughly half a mile away, well outside of the range of the British. For a short while, the warriors rest in the morning sun and take snuff. These warriors, mostly veterans ranging in age from their 30s to their 50s, have eaten little to nothing over the course of the last 48 hours. They have run what amounts to several marathons back to back, only to carry out nearly 24 straight hours of the most ruthless, costly combat they have likely ever seen. They have lost many men here, with an estimated 350 killed and 500 wounded, and they too are tired. After a brief respite, the Zulu rise and then depart. A reserved sense of relief overtakes the British. They are unsure if more Zulu forces are nearby, or whether or not General Chelmsford and his men are even still alive, much less on the way to reinforce them. However, not long after the Zulu depart, a line of horsemen in red coats and white helmets is seen on the horizon. At first, the survivors at Rorke's Drift cannot believe their eyes. It is General Chelmsford's column. Finally, the British can breathe at least a measured sigh of relief. 17 of their 141 troops have been killed in the fight, along with 15 men wounded. An additional fatality is nearly incurred when Private Waters comes bounding towards the camp, his face smeared black with coal and covered in a large black jacket. He had found the jacket in the wardrobe of the abandoned room, thrown it over his head, and fled, through the attacking Zulu, into the darkness of the night. He had hidden in a ditch until sunlight, being repeatedly trampled upon by charging Zulu who did not notice him. When he was spotted by the weary, worn-out rifleman, he was nearly shot. Several of the defenders of the hospital of Rorke's Drift have incurred terrible injuries, with Henry Hook being hit by the glancing blow of a Zulu spear and now bleeding profusely from a gash in his forehead, and John Williams' hands being rubbed raw from the incessant, frantic digging. To a man, all will suffer from the wounds they incurred in the fight for the remainder of their lives. They, along with the other wounded, have been tended to by Surgeon James Henry, who worked fearlessly and tirelessly through the night, treating the wounded and dying. Amidst the gunfire and screams, the surgeon and the soldiers hear the sharp barks and yips of the surgeon's loyal terrier, Jack. As his master worked, Jack did his best throughout the night to alert the defenders to any Zulu hiding behind the walls of biscuit tins and cornmeal bags. In the coming days, Chelmsford's troops will scour the surrounding countryside, killing any Zulu they can find. General Chelmsford will spend the next few weeks and months attempting to save his reputation and to exact his revenge on any Zulu he can find. In the aftermath of Rorke's Drift, the battle will be held up in the British media as an example of at least some measure of British retribution in the face of their outright slaughter at Isandlwana. The Victoria Cross, the British Army's highest award for valor in combat, will be awarded to more British troops in this battle than any battle in British military history. In total, 11 Victoria Crosses are awarded. With great honor and ceremony, the medals are pinned to the chests of Lieutenant John Chard, Lieutenant Gonville Brumhead, Corporal William Wilson Allen, Private Frederick Hitch, Private Alfred Henry Hook, Private Robert Jones, Private John Williams, Sergeant Major James Henry Reynolds, Corporal Christian Ferdinand Scheiss, and Private William Jones. William will leave the Army in 1880, as will most of the survivors of Rorke's Drift. He moves back to Birmingham and attempts to restart his life with a series of menial labor jobs. Like many of the survivors, Jones struggles to readjust to the normalities of day-to-day life in Victorian England. He was unable to establish himself in a career and has thus, in 1887, signed on with Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show as they make their tour through Europe. Now, here in Earl's Court amidst the clamor and clatter backstage, he snaps out of the memory he has relived so many times and steels his resolve for another performance. He clears his head as best he can and does his best to forget the pain of his rheumatism, another after effect of his time spent in the rain-soaked, sun-scorched misery of Rorke's Drift. His job is to give his account of that terrible day, as well as a general retrospective on the Anglo-Zulu War. Each time he does, his nostrils fill with the smell of the bodies that had been left to burn in the hospital. But he carries on. William gives his account for the crowd, including the Queen, as he will do time and again for crowds throughout Europe in the coming months. But the funds from these performances will last but a short time, and he will continue to struggle financially. He will be forced to pawn his Victoria's Cross in 1910 and is admitted to a workhouse, an institution for those unable to care for themselves, in Manchester. Many nights he wakes in a panic and attempts to charge out of the building, believing that he is back in Rorke's Drift and that the Zulus are attacking. He will pass away on April 15, 1913, and be buried in a pauper's grave in Phillips Park Cemetery in Manchester. Though he would finally receive a proper gravestone in 2007 after a 4-year public campaign, his unfortunate ending is, tragically, not at all unique amongst the survivors of Rorke's Drift. The fight that saved their lives, in many cases, also permanently scarred them, physically and psychologically, as it likely did their Zulu enemies, who fought just as hard and suffered greatly. But the battle at Rorke's Drift would not only go on to shape the lives of its participants, but to shape the public view of the British involvement in Africa. The expansion of their territory there, as well as the conquering of the Zulu, would quickly come to be seen as an empirical necessity for the British. The Anglo-Zulu War, as it would come to be known, will go on to be regarded as one of the most seminal campaigns in British military history. By midsummer of 1879, the Zulu Empire would be soundly routed by the British after several costly battles. But the stories of those battles, as well as the countless stories of heroism and brutality on both sides, are other stories for other times. Central Texas, January 23, 1871. Amidst the rolling landscape that surrounds them, on an isolated strip of cattle trail, 3 working cowboys ride west from the town of Weatherford. They are on their way to the ranch of Brit Johnson, better known as Brit Johnson, who rides at the head of the group. They intend to gather Johnson's cattle and make a return trip to sell them in Weatherford. With Johnson are Dennis Curtin and Paint Crawford. All 3 men are known and respected locally for their skill as cowhands and their dealings in business. They are all also ex-slaves, officially made American citizens and given their freedom less than a decade earlier. However, despite the tenuous state of the nation in the Reconstruction era, Brit Johnson has built a reputation amongst all peoples of the area as a forthright and upstanding citizen, as well as a local hero. 7 years prior, in the summer of 1864, while still under the bonds of slavery, Johnson had been commissioned by his then master to travel to nearby Parker County to procure supplies for the ranch. Brit Johnson had left his wife and young children with the Fitzpatrick family, trusting that they would be safe from the incessant Comanche and Kiowa raiding that plagued the area at the time. Upon his return, Johnson was met with the horrifying news that the small neighborhood he and his family called home had been laid waste to. His son, Jim, and several members of the Fitzpatrick family had been murdered, and the rest of his family had been kidnapped by Comanche and Kiowa raiders. He had secured written permission from his then master to travel alone on the frontier, a legal necessity at the time, and then ventured out on his own in search of not only his family, but the surviving members of the white Fitzpatrick family as well. After months of tracking, and subsequently working his way into the good graces of the tribes, Johnson had been able to negotiate trades for the return of not only his family, but all of the surviving members that had been taken in what came to be known to history as the Elm Creek Raid. Some members of the tribes, though, regarded his dealings as being underhanded and self-interested, as he had reportedly absconded with more rescued captives than the Kiowa and Comanche had agreed to. Thus, some warriors of both tribes vowed that, should the opportunity ever arise, they would take their retribution on Brit Johnson. Now, 7 years later, Johnson pulls his large horse to a halt, as the men set out to make camp for the night. The trusted steed has been with him since before he ventured out alone in search of his family, and is not only a trusted workmate, but a treasured companion. Scampering around the horse's feet, Johnson's small dog greets his owner as he steps from his saddle to the ground, whimpering and excitedly wagging his tail. Though the scene might appear akin to that of a relatively placid modern-day trail ride, the situation at hand is anything but. Though considerable time has passed since the Elm Creek Raid, hostilities between settlers on the Texas frontier and the mighty Comanche and Kiowa tribes still rage, and any territory between towns and homesteads is considered to be dangerous ground for travelers. All 3 men, though, are seasoned hands at both working cattle and fighting hostile native tribes. Thus, they carry about their work of setting up camp for the night with a workmanlike deliberation that, to the outside observer, seems wholly untroubled by the potential danger at hand. However, all 3 men are also heavily armed with repeating rifles and Colt revolvers, a necessity in this territory. They also carry hundreds of rounds of ammunition. As the men finish making camp and prepare to bed down for the evening, they notice another group of working cowhands, hauling freight to Weatherford, camped roughly 1.5 miles away. Thinking themselves to be relatively safe for the night, the men soon drift off to sleep after consuming a cold supper. The next morning, January 24th, arrives with the typical merciless chill that plagues the country throughout the winter. As the morning sun begins to peek over the horizon, Brit Johnson, Dennis Curtin, and Paint Crawford rise and begin to prepare themselves and their horses to move on for the day. However, just as their thoughts begin to drift to preparing breakfast and what the day's travel might hold, the 3 men in the small camp are startled by the sickening sound of thunderous hoofbeats cutting through the morning stillness. Looking in the direction of the sound, the three men see an oncoming cloud of 25 Kiowa warriors, bearing down upon their encampment at full speed. The Kiowa are in the area conducting raiding on local homesteads when they have spotted Brit Johnson and company the day prior. Seeking to make good on their old promise of settling their score with Johnson, they now charge upon the camp in full regalia, their war whoops intermittently piercing through the thunderous cacophony of their horses' hoofbeats. Though a completely separate and much smaller tribe than their allies in the Comanche, the Kiowa are just as renowned in this territory for their bravery, horsemanship, and ruthlessness. While the Comanche are known for their Spartan-like ornamentation, though that has begun to change in the latter 19th century, the Kiowa possess a far more complex cultural tapestry of dress, religion, economics, and social structure. The Kiowa that now charge upon the camp are more ornately dressed than their Comanche counterparts, but their tactics, once familiar to Johnson, Curtin, and Crawford, are drawn from the same well of knowledge and experience drawn upon by the Comanche, as well as other Plains tribes. Rather than a head-on charge at the cowhands' campsite, the warriors maneuver forward in a whirling cyclone, in which the rider nearest the target fires his shot, before continuing on to the back of the circle to reload and return for another shot. The whirlwind of bullets and arrows soon encircles the entirety of the small three-man camp, which provides no cover to its inhabitants. Now, the once placid campsite is engulfed in the storm of violence, as all three men scramble for any semblance of cover they can find. They pour fire from their rifles into the thick oncoming Kiowa formation, loosing dozens of rounds in little more than a few minutes. However, essentially caught in the open, Curtin and Crawford are quickly cut down by Kiowa bullets and arrows. With no other options at hand, Brit Johnson draws the large bowie knife he keeps in a scabbard on his belt and, after a heart-wrenching few milliseconds, dispatches his beloved horse with the large steel blade. The hulking animal falls where it had stood, and Johnson takes what sparse cover he can find behind the animal's corpse. Now, aside from his small dog, Brit Johnson is the only remaining member of the camp left alive. From their vantage point roughly a mile and a half away, the team of ranch hands hauling freight to Weatherford can only watch as the fight unfolds, afraid of drawing the much larger Kiowa force's ire upon themselves. They watch, awestruck, as Brit Johnson now fights for his very life in a battle that he very likely knows is lost. However, Johnson fights on with the fury of a man possessed. In a momentary lull in the attack, he scrambles to the bodies of his comrades and procures their firearms and ammunition, before retaking his position behind the body of his horse and continuing to pour fire into the ranks of the Kiowa. With seemingly robotic efficiency, Johnson continues to fire and reload, methodically picking off his attackers as the relentless succession of charges continues. No one can know what thoughts crossed the mind of Brit Johnson during these lonesome, fearful moments. It is a safe assumption, however, that the memories of his beloved wife and children, now only a few dozen miles away, flood his mind. So too might have the memories of his time with the tribes, the killing of his son, and the promises of the disaffected warriors to exact their revenge. Though no one can know his thoughts in his final minutes, Brit Johnson's actions now become the stuff of Texas legend. As the Kiowa warriors dart around him like a swarm of enraged hornets, Johnson gives no quarter and asks for none. Shot after shot rings out, deafening all within earshot as the ground seems to quake with the rumble of the horse's hooves. Finally, though by what means we are unsure, Brit Johnson is struck by either a bullet or an arrow and dealt a mortal wound. Though the onlooking men of the freight-hauling detail are unable to discern the moment at which Johnson is killed, they witness the Kiowa swarm his position and know that all is lost for the brave lone cowboy. Hours later, they venture forth to the site of the battle, assured the Kiowa have now left the area. What they find bespeaks a fight and an aftermath that, even on the bleeding edge of the Texas frontier, was unique in both its brutality and its ruthlessness. They find the bodies of Dennis Curtin and Paint Crawford where they had fallen, the tops of both their heads freshly scalped. They see the body of Johnson's horse, prostrate in its last act of service, riddled with bullets and pincushioned with arrows. Behind the body of the horse, they find Brit Johnson. He has been terribly mutilated, with his face gruesomely disfigured, scalped, and eviscerated. So, too, has the body of his small but eternally faithful dog, found shoved into Johnson's torso. However, in a testament to Johnson's commitment to fight until the end, 173 cartridges are found scattered around his body. To the men investigating the site, and in the eye of posterity, this is a near unbelievable amount of firepower for one man to have unleashed during a fight that was all but assuredly lost before it even began. In the end, the bodies of Brit Johnson, Dennis Cureton, and Paint Crawford are buried in a common grave next to the road near which they fell. A small marker with all three of their names is left at the spot, which is today marked by an official Texas Historic Site marker. Though he was not afforded a major affair for a funeral, and was meant to suffer some of the worst indignities wrought upon American citizens within its tumultuous history, Brit Johnson is remembered as a Texas legend and an example to all of what selflessness, determination, and bravery really mean. For their part, the Kiowa would go on to retreat to the northwest, to the vast open plains. Here, they would again join forces with the Comanche in the ensuing 4 years in what would come to be known to history as the Red River War. This war would ultimately spell the beginning of the end for both the Kiowa and the Comanche, two powerful tribes that had been ravaged for decades by warfare and disease. But the many tales of the Red River War, as well as the full story of Brit Johnson's one-man ventures to reclaim his family, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. San Diego, California, December 5th, 1846. As a dreary overcast sky looms above them, Captain Archibald Gillespie and his detachment of 40 U.S. Marines ride east from the city into the dry, chaparral-covered desert that looms endlessly before them. They are on their way to join forces with Brigadier General Stephen F. Kearny and his force of 200 troops, who have sent word to the Marines that they are caught in dire straits in the middle of the Southern California desert. General Kearny and his men have traveled to their current location, roughly 30 miles east of the bustling pueblo of San Diego, as part of the United States' efforts during the ongoing Mexican-American War. Though they have endured seemingly endless hardships on their journey from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, to the city of Santa Fe, and then across the vast expanses of the deserts of present-day New Mexico and Arizona, before finally reaching the deserts of Alta California, most of the men are eager to find and engage their enemy in the Mexican army. However, General Kearny's force is still diminutive in size and thousands of miles away from their closest support to the east. Seeing the increasingly dangerous circumstances, Kearny had seen it necessary to send a rider to San Diego requesting reinforcements. This request reached the headquarters of Captain Archibald Gillespie, where he had hurriedly marshaled the contingent of U.S. Marines he now leads eastward in their effort to reach General Kearny and his men before they are forced to engage with the local forces that are surely reconnoitering the hills around them. These local forces, Gillespie and his men are well aware, are unlike the rest of their counterparts in the Mexican army, whom the U.S. forces have combated in the previous few years. With Alta or Upper California comprising the northernmost reaches of Mexican territory, its inhabitants, Mexican citizens known as Californios, have adapted their country's culture to fit their environs. In the vast expanses of Californio ranchos, which could comprise thousands of acres, becoming an adept horseman was essential not only for working vaqueros, but also everyday citizens simply wishing to get from one place to another in this expansive land. Throughout the whole of Mexico, the Californios were regarded as unmatched in not only their horsemanship, but their adroitness in wielding their long leather riatas, precursors to the modern-day cowboy's rope. It was said that a Californio would rather climb atop his horse and ride 100 yards rather than walk it, and that any Californio was a better roper with his foot than the average Mexican was with his hand. But these are not the only attributes that separate the Californio soldiers that General Kearny and his men will be facing and the regular Mexican army fighting further to the south. Their most noticeable characteristic, and perhaps their most dangerous, is evident even from afar to the scouts and soldiers watching them from the cover of the dense chaparral brush. Long, steel-tipped lances jut upward several feet from over the heads of each California rider, giving them an air of medieval simplicity that seems antiquated even here in the 1840s Southern California desert. But, while many among the Americans find the spectacle to be nearly comical, the damage that these lances can inflict is far from a laughing matter for anyone faced with combating them. Though the Californios are lacking in way of firearms and ammunition, their ability to inflict grievous wounds upon their adversaries before dashing away gives them a capability scarcely seen outside of the mighty tribes of the American plains, like the Cheyenne, the Lakota, and the Comanche. Against a fighting force armed with single-shot carbines, they present a formidable foe. It had been at what history has come to know as the Battle of the Old Woman's Gun, when a detachment of unfortunate U.S. Navy sailors, Marines, and civilian volunteers had attempted to march on the burgeoning city of Los Angeles in an effort to quell an uprising in the area that had been previously conquered by American forces. This detachment, composed of 310 men, had been caught by the Californios just outside of the city and made to pay dearly over the course of a battle that lasted a night and the succeeding day. During the engagement, 4 American sailors had been killed, and 6 additional men gravely wounded at the end of the Californios' lances. Captain Archibald Gillespie, for his part, has spent the previous few months clinging tenuously to any semblance of power over the city of Los Angeles, having been appointed to the post by Robert F. Stockton, with explicit orders to rule over the city with a strict eye and an unforgiving hand. But, after continued unrest from the inhabitants of the city, with some in support of the Americans' efforts and some vehemently opposed, Stockton and Gillespie retreated southward by sailing to San Diego on October 26, 1846. They arrived 5 days later, on October 31st, and were welcomed by the local inhabitants of the besieged city to take part in their celebrations of All Souls' Day. However, despite their warm reception, the men had found San Diego to be all but bereft of usable horses, mules, and cattle. While Stockton had returned north to Monterey, where Commanding Officer John C. Fremont was experiencing similar problems, Captain Gillespie and his men had set about procuring as many animals and supplies as they could while staying within the good graces of the citizens. At this critical juncture in the Mexican-American War, the Americans now found themselves clinging to largely nominal control of the Southern California coastline stretching down from San Francisco. They were running low on men, ammunition, and supplies. However, General John Kearny, on his trek westward from the desert, mistakenly believed his countrymen to have solidified a strong measure of control over nearly the whole of the territory. In the middle of the New Mexico desert, Kearny and his men had happened upon none other than the legendary mountain man Kit Carson, whom John C. Fremont had dispatched to Washington to carry correspondence regarding the Americans' progress in Alta California. After reviewing these dispatches, General Kearny had felt so hopeful as to the state of the Americans' advancement that he sent nearly half of his forces back to Santa Fe. He did, however, enlist the famed Carson to accompany him and his men back to Southern California. Now, Carson, among the most experienced in the group by far in matters of frontier warfare, rides with Kearny's cavalry, dressed in his mountain man trappings and sitting astride his sure-footed mule. He shares Kearny's growing concern with the group's isolation. The men amongst the cavalry, however, are by and large in high spirits, despite the toll taken on themselves and their animals by the months-long journey west. They have come here to fight what they believe to be a markedly inferior enemy, not only lacking in their training and equipment, but in fact relegated to using centuries-old technology in a desperate bid against a superior foe. Still, the obviousness of their predicament is not lost on the men of the cavalry, and all among them welcome the sight of Captain Gillespie and his Marines rumbling towards them in the afternoon, kicking up a sizable cloud of dust and towing with them a small brass cannon to add to the artillery firepower of the soldiers. Kearny and Carson both warmly greet Gillespie, who informs the general, much to his chagrin, that the state of affairs for the Americans in Southern California has deteriorated, even in the time since Carson has skulked out of San Diego with his secret correspondence for President James K. Polk. He also assures them that their suspicions that the Californios might be very close by are likely justified, Unfortunately for the Americans, Gillespie is more correct than he knows, as word of he and his men's departing San Diego has already reached two nearby parties of California Lancers. One, commanded by Leonardo Cota and Jose Alipas, is stationed at San Luis Rey to the north. When word reaches their headquarters, a contingent of Lancers immediately heads south to join forces with their brethren in order to mount an attack. Meanwhile, the second contingent of Lancer forces, commanded by Don Andres Pico, brother of the governor Pio Pico, is stationed in San Diego. Don Andres commands virtually the whole of the city outside of the American-held ports. He has now received word that the group of Marines has evaded Mexican security forces and is headed east into the desert. As yet unaware of Kearny's forces, they assume the men are yet again attempting to scour the countryside in search of horses and cattle. The two forces meet at San Luis Rey, where Pico, the senior officer, sees fit to divide their forces in an effort to more effectively scout the vast expanse of desert. Half of the men are sent south to El Cajon, while Pico and his contingent of 78 men make their way east into the desert, scouring the landscape for any sign of intruding American forces. In the late afternoon, the Californios arrive at the small Native American village of San Pascual. The residents, largely terrified of the Californios after decades of incursion and mistreatment on their part, flee their homes, leaving their shelters to Pico and his men. But that evening, as Pico and his men cook their evening meals over the coals of the natives' fires, one of the tribespeople suddenly comes running back into the village, reporting that they have been found and detained by nearby American forces, numbering far larger than Pico had expected Captain Gillespie's force of Marines to be. Believing the natives' claims to be either lies or outright delusions, Pico largely dismisses them. However, only a few miles away, the flickering candles inside General Kearny's field headquarters tent illuminate the shadows of Kearny, Gillespie, Kit Carson, and a number of other officers as they now discuss what steps to take next, knowing that their enemy is almost certainly close at hand. It is decided that scouts will be sent out to reconnoiter the area and determine the size and strength of the Californios' forces. Lieutenant Thomas C. Hammond is appointed to command a small group of scouts, including some local natives, among them a man named Rafael Machado, who is familiar with both the tactics of the Californios as well as the terrain. In the pre-dawn hours, they ride into the countryside, disappearing into the darkness. Soon, Machado has discerned the location of the Californios at San Pascual. He even crawls forward through the brush, garnering a close enough vantage point to confirm that these mostly sleeping men are in fact Pio's forces. But after Machado is gone for a longer time than he had planned, Lieutenant Hammond becomes anxious that the native Californio Machado has double-crossed him and alerted Pico's men to his presence. Concerned that they will be the victims of an ambush, Hammond orders the remainder of his men to follow him in a silent charge into the village. Despite the men remaining silent, the clattering of their weapons and the pounding of their horses' hooves alert the Californio sentries on watch. Machado is discovered by his companions in this charge, having in fact steadfastly done his duty, and now remounts and joins his cohorts in a hurried retreat as the Californio guards order them to halt. In their haste, one of the soldiers drops their dark blue coat, with the tag U.S. Army sewn on it. Now, not only is Pico aware of the presence of the Americans, he has evidence that there is a larger force afoot than the 39 Marines who had left San Diego. As Lieutenant Hammond breathlessly reports the news of their discovery to General Kearny, Kearny mulls over his options. He decides, against the advice of Carson, that since the element of surprise has now been lost, they must make their attack as quickly as possible. As an early morning frost coats the blankets of the sleeping men, and a thick fog covers the landscape, they are suddenly shaken awake by their officers, and told to make ready for a charge. After shaking off their restless night's sleep, many of the young men are eager to mount up and make the charge to glory that they have traveled so far to take part in. Kearny has, however, taken a number of steps in order to mitigate their risk. He has ordered that their main objective will be to surround the village of San Pascual, capture their horses, and take the men prisoner. However, the general, Carson, and Gillespie are all dubious as to whether or not this plan will be entirely realistic. Meanwhile, the forward observers from Pico's force of Californios dot the horizon with their silhouettes, keenly gathering some rather surprising intelligence as they take stock of the number of Americans present, not so large that an attack would be out of the question, and the condition of their stock, who are now so gaunt after their cross-continental trek that many of them seem near death. Within 15 minutes of being awakened, the men are organizing into their well-drilled formations in preparation for battle. When they had first left Kansas, their companies had been arranged according to the color of their horses, their animals well-fed and energetic, the men's uniforms pressed and well-kempt, and their weapons cleaned, oiled, and ready for use. Now, many of the men ride mules or horses mismatched from their units, and the animal's current state significantly affects their ability to perform. To make matters worse, their carbines cannot be counted on to fire in the damp morning conditions. Thus, this attack will be relegated to swords and single-shot pistols, with the carbine's only use now being in wielding it as a club. The men separate into 3 guards, with the advance guard being commanded by Captain Abram R. Johnston. General Kearney commands the guard behind them, but as the men move out towards the small valley that ensconces the village of San Pasqual, they begin to separate from each other at a greater and greater rate during the course of their travel. As the men near the village, a critical mishap takes place. With the distance between them making the commands all but inaudible, General Kearney's command for Captain Johnston to proceed in a, quote, trot is misheard as a gallop. This is a grave mistake, as the distance to the village is too far for the exhausted horses to reach at full speed, and the advanced force would be too far ahead of the second column for the second column to provide adequate relief. Still, Johnston dutifully issues the order, and the men in the advanced column urge their horses into a gallop. Seeing this, General Kearney is horrified. He exclaims, "Good heavens, I did not mean that!" However, it is too late, and now the distance between the two forces grows even faster. Snapping into action, Kit Carson urges his mule into a full gallop of its own, attempting to catch up to the runaway column, as Kearney keeps his troops at a trot so as not to lose complete control of the battle before it begins. Carson and his mule catch up to the charging Captain Johnston, whose column is now reaching the expanse of the open valley floor. A half a mile away, they can see the village. The attack is now imminent. The 12-man column charges on, with its men roaring out in whoops and battle cries as they make their charge upon the village. But Pico and his Californios have taken cover in a small ravine next to the village, and from here let loose an initial volley of musket fire from their limited collection of firearms. As the gun smoke mixes with the thick fog, Captain Johnston falls from his mount, killed by a musket ball to the head. Riding directly behind him, Kit Carson sees the captain fall. This trips up his own mount, and his normally sure-footed mule takes a disastrous tumble to the ground, launching Carson several yards ahead of the animal, where he lands splayed out and in a daze, before hurriedly scrambling out of the way of the rest of the charging column. The charging soldiers attempt to loose a volley of their own, but most find that their weapons have indeed been rendered useless in the damp conditions. Now, the 11 remaining Americans draw their long sabers and charge head-on towards the Californios. At first, the Californios feign a retreat, momentarily seeming to scatter their forces to the west as they flee along the path of a small creek near the village. Captain Ben Moore, now the officer in charge with Johnston having been killed in the action, orders the men to pursue the Californios immediately. This the men do, giving chase down the banks of the small waterway. But this pursuit draws out their forces even further, making them easy targets for their enemy. As Kearney, Gillespie, and the rest of the men make their way across the valley as quickly as they can on their bedraggled mounts, they can only watch the horror that unfolds next. The Californios, seeing the compromised state of the Americans' forces, now wheel their fine, well-fed, and well-trained horses around, and make a head-on charge towards the soldiers still pursuing them. Within moments, they have surrounded the Americans in a whirling cyclone from which they can strike with their long lances, inflicting deep, grievous wounds, while others among them throw their leather riatas with expert efficiency, ensnaring and unsaddling riders who can then be pounced upon and dispatched in brutal fashion by other lance-wielding Californios. Captain Moore charges at Captain Pico himself, firing off an errant shot from his single-shot pistol before drawing his saber. He engages Pico, an expert swordsman, who manages to slash Moore with his own saber. As Moore attempts to fight off Pico's sword slashes and thrusts, two of Pico's men make separate charges upon the American officer, driving their lances deep into his torso and eventually sending him crumbling to the ground. The fall breaks the blade of Moore's saber, leaving him only the handle of the weapon with which to defend himself. He crawls to a spot near the river, attempting to club and bash any Californio who comes near, but he is soon finished off by a Californio with a pistol. Now, more Americans are starting to arrive at the battlefield, including General Kearny and Captain Gillespie. As he fights, Kearny is viciously wounded by a lance that pierces his lower back. Gillespie fights off numerous vociferous attacks directed at him by a number of attacking lancers, many of whom know who he is and are intent on exacting vengeance upon him personally. For his part, Kit Carson has managed to obtain one of the carbines from the dead U.S. soldiers, one that he miraculously finds to be in working order. He now sits ensconced behind a small rock formation, proffering effective, lethal fire against any Californio who comes within range of his position. Finally, the brass cannons being towed towards the rear of the third column are brought to the field by the American forces, and a powerful volley is let loose towards the Californios. Though it has little effect in the way of lethality, it does manage to momentarily scatter Pico's forces. Now, as Pico and his men survey the battlefield from out of range of the cannons, they are overwhelmed with a collective joy at not only having survived, but tactically dominated a better trained, better equipped, and much larger opposition force. For their part, General Kearny, Captain Gillespie, and Kit Carson are now left to survey a macabre scene of death and gore that seems to cover the whole of the valley floor. They are now trapped here, with many dead and many wounded, still 30 miles from the nearest friendly forces in San Diego, and with Pico and his Californios now stalking the hills all around them in order to cut off any route of escape. During the night, the men who are uninjured go about the grisly task of digging a large communal grave for their comrades, before laying their bodies down inside of it, covering them up, and walking their horses over the top to tamp down the ground to keep their comrades' bodies safe from the frothing packs of hungry wolves that now seem to fill the valley, having smelled the blood and viscera that now litter its floor. In the next few days, the Californios will take great hope in their ability to perhaps defend themselves from the encroaching American forces after so many months of doubt. They will hound General Kearny's forces, making any likelihood of their escape to San Diego, especially with many wounded in tow, nearly impossible. It will ultimately be up to Kit Carson, as well as a native guide and a naval officer, who will volunteer to make a death-defying nighttime trek to San Diego in hopes of garnering relief forces for their comrades. But the story of Kit Carson and his comrades' impossible task, and the conclusion of the brutal, bloody, and callous Mexican-American War are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Thank you again for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the join button below. And we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.